Der kleine Herr Friedemann by Thomas Mann, produced by Janice Erner, and the online distributed notes on transcription. The spelling and punctuation of the original text have been retained. Only obvious printing errors have been corrected. A list of changes made appears at the end of the text. The table of contents has been moved from the end of the book to before the title page. Locked in printed text in the original is marked with an underscore. Or original bolded text is marked with an equal sign. Collection Fisher, Herman Bang, The Four Devils. Peter Altenberg Ashanti. M2, Maria Janicic, Raoul and Irene. M1. Peter Nansen from The Diary of a Lover. M2G, V. Beaulieu, his brother. M1. Thomas Mann. M2. Otto Erich Hartleben, The Generous Pastor. Mann. Each volume in this edition includes an illustrated cover priced at 2 marks per copy. Thomas Mann, Novellas, Berlinese, Fischer Verlag, 1898. All rights reserved. Contents page 3. Death 55, The Will to be Happy 69, Disappointment, Renan 3, The Bajazzo 117, Tobias Mindernickel 81I. The nurse had the fault. What did it avail that, when the first suspicion arose, Mrs. Consul Friedman sternly admonished her to suppress this vice? What did it help that she administered to her, besides nutritious beer, a glass of red wine each day? It suddenly turned out that this girl had also been drinking the spirit meant for the kitchen appliances, and before any replacement arrived or she could be sent away, the misfortune occurred. When the mother and her 3 half-grown daughters returned from an outing one day, little Johannes, who was about old, lay on the floor, having fallen off the changing table with a most pitiful wail, while the nurse stood there stuperously. The doctor, who examined the contorted and trembling little creature's limbs with careful firmness, made a very, very serious face as the 3 daughters stood sniffling in a corner, and Mrs. Friedman, overcome with heart-rending fear, prayed aloud. The poor woman had already endured before the birth of this child, her husband, the Dutch consul, to be swept away by an equally sudden and violent illness, and she was still too broken to harbour any hope that little Johannes might remain with her. After 2 days, however, the doctor assured her, with a reassuring handshake, that there was no immediate danger. The slight brain affection especially had entirely vanished, as one could see from his gaze, which no longer bore the rigid expression it had at first. Of course, one would have to wait and see how things developed, as always, and hope for the best, as mentioned. The grey-gabled house in which Johannes Friedman grew up stood at the north gate of the old, moderately sized trading town. Through the front door one entered a spacious tiled hall from which a staircase with a white painted wooden railing led up to the upper floors. Here is the translation of the text, preserving the name Manon. The wallpapers in the living room on the first floor depicted faded landscapes, and around the heavy mahogany table with the dark red plush cover stood stiff, backed furniture. Here he often sat as a child at the window, where beautiful flowers always bloomed, on a small stool at his mother's feet, listening to her smooth, greying hair and her kind, gentle face, while inhaling the subtle scent that always seemed to emanate from Hear a Wonderful Tale. Or perhaps he would be shown the image of his father, a friendly man with a greybeard. The mother said he was in heaven, waiting for them all there. Behind their house was a small garden where much of the day during summer was spent, despite the sweet mist that almost always wafted over from a nearby sugar refinery. An old gnarled walnut tree stood there, and young man often sat on a low wooden chair under its shade, cracking nuts, while Mrs. Friedemann and her 3 now adult sisters gathered together in a grey canvas tent. The mother's gaze would often leave her handiwork to drift with a wistful kindness towards the child. He wasn't handsome young man, and as he sat hunched over on the stool with his pointed high chest, his wide, reaching back, and his far too long thin arms, cracking nuts with eager dexterity, he presented a most peculiar sight. But his hands and feet were delicate and slender, and he had large hazel eyes, a soft mouth, and fine light brown hair. Despite his face sitting so forlorn between his shoulders, it was almost beautiful to look at. When Mann turned 7, he started school, and from then on, the years passed in a monotonous blur. He would walk daily with an oddly serious gait characteristic of adults, between the gabled houses and shops towards the old school building with its Gothic arches. After completing his tasks at home, he'd read from his books with their beautiful, colourful titles or work in the garden, while his sisters, who ran the household due to their ailing mother, tended to business. They also attended social gatherings, since the Friedemanns were part of the city's elite. However, they hadn't married yet, as their wealth wasn't substantial, and they weren't exactly attractive. Mann occasionally received invitations from his peers, but he didn't enjoy their company much. He couldn't participate in their games, and as they always maintained a reserved distance towards him, true camaraderie never blossomed. There came a time when he often heard them speak of certain experiences in the schoolyard. He listened intently with wide eyes as they spoke of their infatuations with this or that girl, remaining silent. These things, he thought to himself, that others seem so filled with. I am not suited for such as gymnastics and playing catch. This sometimes made him a little sad, but eventually he was always accustomed to standing up for himself and not sharing in the interests of others. And yet, when he was 16 years old, he developed a sudden inclination towards a girl of his age. She was the sister of one of his classmates, a blonde, exuberantly cheerful creature, and through her brother he got to know her. He felt a strange restlessness in her presence, and the apprehensive and artificially friendly way she treated him filled him with deep sorrow. One summer afternoon, as he walked alone on the city walls, he heard whispers behind a jasmine bush and listened carefully between the branches. On the bench that stood there sat that girl next to a tall, red-haired boy he well knew. He had his arm around her and was kissing her lips, which she laughed at. When Johannes Friedemann saw this, he turned around and quietly walked away. His head drooped lower than ever between his shoulders, his hands trembled, and a sharp, burning pain rose from his chest to his throat. But he stifled it and resolutely straightened up as best he could. Fine, he said to himself, that's over. I will never again be concerned about all of this. It brings happiness and joy to others, but only sorrow and hardship to me. I'm done with it. Never again. The resolve suited him well. He renounced it forever. He went home and picked up a book or played the violin, something he had learned despite his mature chest. At 17 he left school to become a merchant, like everyone in his circle, and started as an apprentice at Mr. Schlievock's large lumber yard by the river, below town. He was treated with leniency, and he himself was friendly and accommodating, peacefully and orderly. Time passed. But when he turned 21, his mother died after a long illness. This was a great sorrow for Johannes Friedemann, which he cherished for a long time. He savoured this pain, embraced it. One gives oneself over to great fortune, nursed it with thousands of childhood memories, and exploited it as his first powerful experience. Isn't life itself something good, whether or not it is shaped for us so that we call it happy? Johannes Friedman felt this, and he loved life. No one understood how carefully he, who had renounced the greatest happiness life could offer, knew how to enjoy the pleasures that were accessible to him. A walk in springtime outside in the city's parks, the scent of a flower, a bird's song. Couldn't one be grateful for such things? And that education involves enjoying, yes, that education is always only equal to enjoyment. He understood this too, and he educated himself. He loved music and attended all the concerts. Here is the translation of the text, preserving the name Man in the city. Various events were organized. Mann himself played gradually, although he stood out as remarkably peculiar while playing the violin, and he found it not bad, enjoying every beautiful and soft note he managed to produce. He had also developed a literary taste over time through extensive reading, which he didn't share with anyone in the city. He was well versed in recent developments both at home and abroad, appreciated the rhythmic allure of poetry, and allowed himself to be swept up by the intimate atmosphere of finely written novellas. Oh, one could almost say he was an Epicurean. He learned to appreciate everything as enjoyable, and considered almost foolish to distinguish between happy and unhappy experiences. He embraced all his feelings and moods willingly, nurturing both the gloomy and the cheerful, even unfulfilled desires, longing. He loved them for their own sake, believing that with satisfaction came the end of the best things. Is the sweet, painful, vague yearning and hoping of silent spring evenings not more enjoyable than any fulfillment the summer might bring? Yes, he was a little man named Friedemann, an Epicurean. That's what people didn't know when they greeted him on the street with that sympathetic friendliness he had always been accustomed to. They didn't realize that this unhappy cripple, marching down the streets in his bright overcoat and cylinder, he was surprisingly vain, loved life tenderly, allowing it to flow gently around him without grand gestures, but filled with a quiet and delicate happiness that he created for himself. However, Herr Friedmann's primary inclination, his true passion, was theatre. He had an incredibly strong dramatic sense, and at the powerful stage effect of a tragic play, his entire small body could tremble. He had a specific spot on the first level of the city theatre that he visited regularly, and from time to time his 3 sisters accompanied him there. They had been managing their household alone since their mother's death, dividing ownership of the old house with their brother. Unfortunately, they were still not married, but they had long reached an age where one may do. Friedrich, the oldest, was 17 years older than Mann. She and her sister Henriette were a bit tall and thin, while Fifi, the youngest, appeared much too small and stout. The latter, by the way, had a peculiar habit of shaking herself with every word, causing moisture to appear in her mouth corners. Mann didn't pay much attention to the 3 girls. They remained loyal to each other and always agreed. Especially when an engagement occurred within their circle of friends, they unanimously emphasized it was very pleasant. Their brother continued to live with them even after leaving Missa. Schlievock's lumber business and starting his own small enterprise, taking over some kind of agency or the like, which didn't require much work. He had a few. Here is the translation, preserving the name, a man. The ground floor rooms of the house allowed him to climb only the stairs during meals, as he occasionally suffered from asthma. On his 33rd birthday, a bright and warm June day after lunch, Mann sat in the grey garden tent with a new neck roll Henriette had made for him, a good cigar in his mouth, and a good book in his hand. From time to time he would put down the book, listen to the joyful chirping of sparrows sitting in the old oak tree, and look at clean gravel path leading to the house and the lawn with its colourful beds. He had no beard, and his face had barely changed, only that features had become slightly sharper. His fine, light brown hair was neatly combed to the side. As he once let the book sink down to his knees and blinked up at the blue sunny sky, he said to himself, "Now 30 years have passed. Perhaps another 10 or even 20 will come, God knows. They'll arrive silently and smoothly, like those that have gone before, and I await them with peace of mind." In July of the same year, a change in the district command occurred that stirred up everyone. The portly, jovial man who had held this position for many years was very popular in social circles, and his departure was regretted. No one knew exactly what brought Herr von Rinlingen from the capital to this town. The exchange seemed quite favourable, as the new major, married but childless, rented a very spacious villa in the southern suburb, suggesting that he intended to build a house. The rumour that he was exceptionally wealthy was also confirmed by his bringing 4 servants, 5 riding and carriage horses, a landau, and a light hunting wagon. The aristocrats began paying visits to distinguished families soon after their arrival, and their name was on everyone's lips. However, the main focus was not Herr von Rinlingen himself, but his wife. The gentlemen were bewildered and had no immediate judgment. The ladies, however, did not agree with Judas von Rinlingen's character and behaviour. One can sense the city air. Mrs. Lawyer Hagenstrom remarked to Henrietta Friedemann, "Well, of course. She smokes," she writes, agreed, "but her demeanour is not just free, it's almost boyish, and that's not quite right. You see, she's not unattractive. One could even find her pretty. Yet she lacks every feminine allure, and something is missing in her gaze, laughter, and movements that men love. She's not coquettish, and I am, God knows, the last to say that's not commendable, but can a young woman, she's 24 years old, completely lack the natural, graceful charm? Beaten, you will see that she turns her back on him completely after a few weeks." "Well," Miss Friedemann said, "she is well taken care of." "Where's her?" Mrs. Hagenstrom exclaimed. "How does she treat him? You should see, you will see." I am the first to insist that a married woman must be, to some extent, repellent towards the other sex. But how does she behave towards her own? She has a way of looking him coldly and addressing him with a pitying emphasis, "Dear friend," which angers me, for you have to see him correct, upright. Chivalrous, a splendidly preserved 40-year-old officer, 4 years married, dearest. Oh. Why? The place where little Mr. Friedemann was first granted the pleasure of seeing Mrs. von Rinlingen was the main street with almost exclusively business buildings, and this encounter took place around noon, as he had just come from the stock exchange, where he had spoken his piece. He strolled along, tiny yet important, next to the large merchant Stevens, an unusually tall and robust man with a round, shaven beard and incredibly thick eyebrows. Both wore cylinder hats and had opened their jackets due to the intense heat. They discussed politics, rhythmically tapping their walking sticks on the pavement. But when they had reached about the middle of the street, Mr. Stevens suddenly exclaimed, By all that's holy, there comes Mrs. Rinlingen. Well, that's lucky. Mr. Friedemann replied in his high and somewhat sharp voice, looking straight ahead expectantly. I haven't seen her yet. There she is in the yellow carriage, he continued, pointing to a yellow hunting carriage used by Mrs. von Rinlingen that day. She was driving it herself with 2 slender horses, while her servant sat behind her with crossed arms. She wore a wide, very pale jacket, and even the skirt was pale. Under the small, round, small straw hat with a brown leather band, her fiery red hair was styled over her ears, falling in a thick knot deep into her neck. Her oval face had a matte white complexion, and there were blue shadows in the corners of her unusually close, set brown eyes. A little saddle of freckles sat on her short but neatly cut nose, making her look well put together. However, whether her mouth was beautiful, one could not tell, as she perpetually pushed her lower lip forward and back, while chewing it against her upper lip. Mr. Stevens greeted Mrs. von Rinlingen with extraordinary deference when the carriage drew near, and little Mr. Friedemann also removed his hat, looking at her intently and respectfully. She lowered her whip, gave a slight nod, and drove slowly past, glancing at the houses and shops on either side. A few steps later, Miss Stevens said she went for a drive and is now heading home. Mr. Friedemann didn't respond, but looked straight ahead at the pavement. Suddenly he looked at Miss Stevens and asked, "How does she treat him?" Here is the translation of the text with the name preserved as Mann. Did you mean that? And Mr. Stevens repeated his sharp remark. Wir. 3 days later, John Friedemann returned home from his regular walk at noon. At 1:30, lunch was served, and he intended to go to his office, which was located just to the right of the front door, for another half hour when the maid came in and said, "There's a visitor, Mr. Friedemann, at my place," he asked. "No, upstairs with the ladies," she replied. Who is it?" "Master and Mrs. Major Lieutenant von Rinlingen." "Oh," said Mr. Friedemann, "I suppose I should go." And he made his way up the stairs. He walked across the landing and was already reaching for the handle of the tall white door leading to the landscape room when he suddenly stopped, took a step back, turned around, and slowly retreated as if he had never come. Although he was entirely alone, he muttered loudly to himself, "No, not today." He went downstairs to his office, sat down at his desk, and picked up the newspaper. After a minute, he lowered it and glanced out the window. He remained seated until the maid announced that lunch was ready. Then he went upstairs to the dining room where his sisters were waiting. He took a seat in a chair where 3 music notebooks lay. Henriette, who was serving the soup, asked, "Do you know who came here?" "The new major lieutenants," he replied. "Yes, so. They're very nice people," said Fifi with a smile. "Certainly," agreed Frederick. "We must not delay our return visit." "I suggest we go tomorrow, Sunday," said Henriette and Fifi in unison. "Will you come with us, John?" asked Frederick. "Of course," exclaimed Fifi, laughing. Mr. Friedemann had completely overlooked the question and was eating his soup with a quiet, anxious expression on his face, as if he were listening to something or hearing some eerie sound. The following evening, the opera Lohengrin was performed at the City Theatre, and all the cultured people of the town attended. The small room was packed from floor to ceiling, filled with a hum, the smell of gas and perfumes. However, all eyes were on Loge 13, directly to the right of the stage, as Mr. and Mrs. von Rinlingen had appeared there for the first time that evening, offering everyone a chance to observe them closely. When little Mr. Friedemann entered his box in a pristine black suit with a glistening white, sharply pointed collar, he paused at the door, making a hand gesture to his forehead and opening his nostrils tightly as if he had heard something strange. Then he sat down, his chair on the left side of Mrs. Rinlingen. She studied him for a moment while he took his seat, pushing her lower lip forward, before turning to exchange a few words with her husband, who stood behind her. He was a tall, broad man, with a bushy moustache and a kind brown face. Mr. Friedemann cast a quick glance at Mrs. von Rinlingen as the overture began, her silhouette bending over the balcony rail. She wore a bright social costume, and among the ladies present even had a hint of D.A. colletage. Her sleeves were very wide and puffy, and the white gloves reached to her elbows. Her figure had a certain opulence today that hadn't been noticeable when she wore the oversized jacket recently. Her bosom rose and fell slowly and fully, and the knot of her reddish blonde hair fell deeply and heavily onto her neck. Mr. Friedemann appeared pale, much paler than usual, with small beads of sweat on his forehead beneath his smoothly combed brown hair. Having brushed against her left arm, resting on the red velvet balcony rail, Mrs. von Rinlingen's glove caught his eye. He saw this round, matte white arm, like the unadorned hand of a veiled, blue, vain creature, constantly. The violins sang, the trumpets chimed in, Terramund fell, and there was general jubilation in the orchestra as the curtain fell. Little Mr. Friedemann sat immobile, pale and silent, his head buried deep between his shoulders, a finger to his mouth, and his other hand resting on the fold of his skirt. As Mrs. von Rinlingen rose to leave with her husband, Mr. Friedemann barely glanced at her, wiped his brow gently with his handkerchief, stood up abruptly, walked to the door leading to the corridor, turned back around, took his seat, and remained motionless in that position. As the signalling bell rang and neighbours returned, he felt Mrs. von Rinlingen's eyes upon him, and without wanting to, he lifted his head towards her. When their gazes met, she showed no embarrassment whatsoever, but continued to observe him attentively until, defeated and humiliated, he lowered his gaze. His face grew even paler, and a strange, sweet anger surged within him. The music started. Nearing the end of this scene, Mrs. von Rinlingen dropped her fan, which fell beside Mr. Friedemann. They both bent to pick it up simultaneously, but she reached for it first, and said with a smile that was more mocking than not, "Thank you." Their heads had been very close together, and he had briefly breathed in the warmth of her chest. His face contorted, his whole body tensed, and his heart pounded so heavily and violently that he felt short of breath. He sat for another half minute before quietly pushing back his chair, standing up, and leaving. He walked down the corridor, following the music, received his cylinder, bright overcoat, and cane at the wardrobe, and descended the stairs to the street. It was a warm, quiet evening. Under the glow of gas lamps, grey gable houses stood silently against the sky. The stars shone brightly and gently. The footsteps of the few people who encountered Herr Friedemann echoed on the pavement. Someone greeted him, but he didn't notice. He kept his head bowed low, and his high, pointed chest trembled as he breathed heavily. From time to time, he whispered softly to himself, "My God, my God." He gazed inwards with a startled and fearful look, seeing how his feelings, which he had so gently nurtured and always treated with kindness, were now torn apart, stirred up, and dishevelled. And suddenly, completely overwhelmed in a state of dizziness, intoxication, longing, and pain, he leaned against a lamp-post and whispered, shuddering, "Gerda." Everything fell silent. Not a single person was to be seen for miles around. He collected himself and continued on his way. He had walked up the street where the theatre stood, which descended steep towards the river, and now followed the main road north towards his apartment. How she had looked at him! How! She had forced him to lower his gaze. She had humbled him with her look. Wasn't she a woman and he a man? And hadn't her strange brown eyes literally twitched with joy? He felt that familiar wave of unconscious, lustful hatred rise within him, but then thought about the moment their heads touched, when he had inhaled the scent of her body, and he stopped for a second time, bending his weathered body backward, drawing in air through his teeth, and murmured again, utterly bewildered, out of control, "My God, my God." And once more he continued walking mechanically, slowly, through the muggy evening air, down the empty, echoing streets, until he stood before his apartment. He paused for a moment on the landing, inhaling the cool, cellar-like scent that filled the place. Then he entered his office. He sat at his desk by the open window and stared straight ahead at a large yellow rose someone had placed in a water glass there. He took it and breathed in its fragrance with closed eyes, but then he pushed it aside with a weary, sad gesture. No, that was over. What was left for him of such sense? What was left of everything that had previously been his luck? He turned to the side and looked out at the silent street. Occasionally, footsteps echoed and faded away. The stars stood still and glistened. How exhausted and weak he felt. His head was empty, and his despair began to dissolve into a great, gentle melancholy. A few lines of poetry fluttered through his mind. The Lohengrin music rang in his ears once more, and he saw Frau von Rinlingen's figure before him again, her white arm on the red velvet, and then he fell into a deep, feverish sleep. Sigh. He was often on the brink of waking up, but he feared it and sank back into unconsciousness each time. However, when it became completely light, he opened his eyes and looked around with a large, painful gaze. Everything stood still. Here is the translation of the text, preserving the name Mann. He felt it clear before his soul. It seemed as if his suffering had not been interrupted at all by sleep. His head was heavy and his eyes burned, but after washing himself and moistening his brow with cologne, he felt better and quietly resumed his place at the window, which remained open. It was still very early in the morning, about 5 o'clock. From time to time a baker's boy would pass by, but otherwise no one was in sight. Across the street all the shops were still closed. Yet birds were chirping and the sky shone brightly blue. It was a beautiful Sunday morning. A feeling of comfort and trust came over little Mr. Friedemann. What could he have been afraid of? Wasn't everything as it always was? Admitting that yesterday had been a bad episode, well, that should be the end of it. It wasn't too late yet. He could still escape destruction. He needed to avoid any situation that might trigger another episode. He felt the strength to do so. He felt the power to overcome it and suffocate it completely within himself. When it struck 7:30, Friedrich entered and placed the coffee on the round table in front of the leather sofa against the far wall. "Good morning, Johannes," she said. "Your breakfast." "Thank you, Mr. Friedemann replied. And then, "Dear Friedrich, I'm sorry you'll have to make this visit alone. I don't feel well enough to accompany you. I had a poor night's sleep, a headache, and in short, I must ask." Friedrich answered, "That's a shame. You must not cancel the visit at all, but it's true that you look sick. Shall I lend you my migraine pen?" "Thank you," Mr. Friedemann said. "It will pass." And Friedrich left. He slowly drank his coffee while standing at the table and ate a croissant. He was content with himself and proud of his resolve. Once finished, he took a cigarette, sat back down by the window, feeling satisfied, happy, and hopeful. He picked up a book, smoked, and blinked out into the sun. The street had come alive, the rumble of wagons, conversations, and the clanging of horse-drawn carriages filled the air. But, above all, the birds chirped merrily, while the radiance of the blue sky sent a soft, warm breeze. At 10 o'clock, he heard the sisters walking across the hallway, heard the front door creak, and then saw the 3 ladies pass by the window without him paying much attention. An hour passed, he felt happier and happier. A sense of audacity began to fill him. What a lovely air there was, and how the birds chirped. How about if he went for a walk, and suddenly, without any further thought, an idea struck him with a sweet fear: if I went to her? And with a determined effort, suppressing all anxious warnings within himself, he added with joyful resolve, "I will go to her." And he put on his black Sunday suit, took the cylinder and cane, and hurried through the whole city to the southern suburb, breathing quickly and impatiently. Without seeing a single person, he raised and lowered his head with eagerness at every step, caught up in an absent, exalted state, until he stood outside in the chestnut alley before the Red Villa, where the name Major Lieutenant von Rinlingen was written on the entrance. Sigh. A tremor overcame him, and his heart beat painfully and heavily against his chest. But he crossed the hall and rang the doorbell. Now it was too late to turn back. Let everything take its course, he thought. Suddenly all was still within him. The door sprang open, the servant came out to meet him on the courtyard, received the card, and hurried up the stairs where a red runner lay. He stared unmoved at Herr Friedemann until the servant returned and explained that the kind lady requested his presence upstairs. Above the salon door where he set down his cane, he glanced in the mirror. His face was pale, with hair stuck to his forehead from being flushed, and his hand, holding the cylinder, shook uncontrollably. The servant opened the door, and he entered. He found himself in a rather large, semi-dark room. The windows were draped. To the right stood a grand piano, and a round table in the middle. Plush armchairs in brown silk were arranged. Over the sofa, on the left side wall, hung a landscape in a heavy gold frame. The wallpaper was dark as well. In the back of the bay window, palms stood. A minute passed until Madeleine von Rinlingen opened the portieres to the right and silently approached him on the thick brown carpet. She wore a simply made red and black check dress. From the bay window a shaft of light fell, dancing with dust directly onto her heavy red hair, making it gleam gold for an instant. She held her inquisitive eyes fixed on him, and pushed out her lower lip as she often did. "Madame," Herr Friedemann began, looking up at her since he was only tall enough to reach her chest, "I would like to reciprocate my call upon you. I regretfully was absent when you visited my sisters, and sincerely regretted it," but he didn't know what else to say. But she stood unmoving, staring at him as if forcing him to continue speaking. Suddenly all the blood rushed to his head. "She wants to torment and insult me," he thought, and she's looking through me! How her eyes are quivering. Finally, she spoke with a bright and clear voice. It is kind of you to come. I also regretted missing you recently. Would you be so kind as to take a seat? She sat down close to him, put her arms on the side rests of the chair, and leaned back. He sat hunched forward, holding his hat between his knees. She said, "Do you know that your Miss Sisters were here just a quarter hour ago?" "They told me. Are you sick?" "That is true," Mr. Friedemann replied. "I didn't feel well this morning. I thought I wouldn't be able to go out. Please excuse my lateness." "You still don't look healthy," she said calmly, her gaze unwavering. "You're pale, and your eyes are inflamed. Is your health not up to par?" "Oh," Mr. Mann stammered, "I'm generally content." "I am often sick myself," she continued, not looking away from him, "but no one seems to notice. I'm nervous and experience strange conditions." She fell silent, chin resting on her chest, gazing at him expectantly. But he did not respond. He sat still, his eyes wide and thoughtful upon her. How peculiar her speech was, and how her bright, unsteady voice affected him. His heart had calmed. It felt as if he were dreaming. "Mrs. von Rinlingen began again. I must be mistaken. If you didn't leave the theatre before the show ended yesterday." "Yes, madame," Mr. Mann answered. "I regretted that. You were a quiet neighbor, even though the performance wasn't good or just relatively so. Do you love music?" "I play a little violin," Mr. Friedemann said. "That is to say, it's not much." "You play the violin?" she asked, then looked past him into the air, thinking. "Then perhaps we could play music together from time to time," she suddenly declared. "We can provide accompaniment. It would make me happy to have found someone here. Will you come?" "I am at your service with pleasure," he replied, still in a dreamlike state. A pause fell between them. Then her face suddenly changed expression. He saw it contort into a barely perceptible, cruel mockery, her eyes again fixed on him with that unsettling tremor they had shown twice before. His face flushed red, and not knowing where to look or how to respond, he left his head dangling between his shoulders, staring blankly at the carpet. But then a brief shower of that helpless, sweet, tormenting anger washed over him. When he lifted his gaze with a desperate resolve, she was no longer looking at him, but calmly gazing past him over his head towards the door. With effort he managed to utter a few words. "And, madam, have you been reasonably satisfied with your stay in our town so far?" "Oh," Mrs. von Rinlingen replied indifferently. "Certainly, why wouldn't I be? Of course I feel a bit cramped and under surveillance. But," she immediately continued, "by the way, before I forget, we plan to have some people over in the next few days for informal gathering. We might play some music, chat. Besides, we have a lovely garden behind our house that runs down to the river. In short, you and your ladies will, of course, receive another invitation, but I ask you, herewith, we extend our invitation to you. Will you grace us with your presence, Mr. Friedemann had barely expressed his thanks and given his assurance when the door handle was forcefully depressed and Lieutenant Colonel entered. Both stood up. And while Mrs. von Rinlingen introduced the gentlemen to each other, her husband bowed to Mr. Friedemann with the same courtesy he showed her. His brown face beamed with warmth. As he removed his gloves, he spoke in his strong, sharp voice, addressing Mr. Friedemann, who stared up at him with unfocused eyes, eagerly awaiting a pat on the shoulder. Meanwhile, Lieutenant Colonel turned to his wife, and with clenched heels and a slightly bent torso, said in a noticeably subdued tone, "Did you ask Mr. Friedemann to join our small gathering? If it pleases you, I think we should organize it in 8 days' time. I hope the weather holds up, and we can also spend time in the garden." "As you wish," Mrs. von Rinlingen replied, glancing past him. 2 minutes later, Mr. Friedemann introduced himself. As he bowed at the door for a final time, their eyes met, her gaze unexpressive upon him. Xaye. He left, not returning to town, but taking a path that branched off from the avenue and led to the former fortress wall along the river. There were well-tended grounds, shady paths, and benches. He walked quickly and mindlessly, never looking up. The heat was unbearable, and he felt the flames rising and falling within him, while a relentless pounding echoed in his weary head. Had she not looked at him yet? But not as before, with an empty, expressionless stare, but with that shuddering cruelty, just as she had spoken to him in that peculiar silent manner. Oh, did it delight her to render him helpless and beside himself? Could she not feel a shred of pity for him if she saw through him? He walked along the river bank, past the green-clad wall, and sat down on a bench surrounded by a half-circle of jasmine bushes. All around, the air was filled with sweet, heavy scents. Before him, the sun beat down on the shimmering water. How tired and worn he felt, yet everything with him raged in torment. Wasn't it best to look around once more, and then descend into the still water, finding brief relief from suffering before being carried away into peace? Oh, that it was what he desired, but not the peace of empty, senseless nothingness, but a gently calming serenity filled with good, quiet thoughts. His entire tender love for life quivered within him at that moment, and deep longing for his lost happiness consumed him. Then he looked around at the silent, indifferent tranquility of nature, saw the river following its path in the sun. Here is the translation, preserving the name Manon. As the grass trembled and the flowers stood where they had bloomed, only to wither and blow away, he saw everything, every single thing, submit silently to existence. Suddenly, a feeling of friendship and sympathy for necessity washed over Hema, sort of superiority over all fate. He recalled that afternoon on his 30th birthday, when, in possession of peace, free from fear and hope, he believed he could look ahead to the rest of his life. There was no light or shadow. Everything lay before him in a gentle twilight until it faded into darkness at the back, almost imperceptibly. With a calm, superior smile, he had greeted the years to come. How long ago was that? At that moment, this woman arrived. She had to come. It was his fate. She herself was his destiny, solely hers. Didn't he feel that from the very beginning? She came, and, despite trying to defend his peace, everything within him revolted against what he had repressed since youth, because he felt it would bring him suffering and ruin. It consumed him with terrible, irresistible force. He was being brought low, he knew. But why fight and suffer any longer? Let things take their course. He could continue on his path, closing his eyes to the gaping abyss behind him, yielding to fate, to the overwhelming, sweet yet tormenting power that one cannot escape. The water glistened. Jasmine exhaled its sharp, sultry scent. Birds chirped in the trees, and a heavy, satiny blue sky shone through them. However, little Mr. Friedemann remained seated on his bench for a long time. He leaned forward, resting his forehead in both hands. Everyone agreed that Rinlingen's gatherings were excellent. Approximately 30 people sat at the lengthy, tastefully decorated table stretching across the vast dining hall. The servant and 2 waiters hurried with trays of ice. There was clinking and clattering, and a warm mist of food and perfumes filled the air. Comfortable merchants with their wives and daughters were present, along with almost all officers of the garrison, an old, beloved doctor, several lawyers, and various other individuals from high society. A mathematics student, a nephew of Lieutenant Colonel who was visiting his relatives, engaged in deep conversations with Miss Hagenstrom, seated across from Mr. Friedemann. He sat on a beautiful velvet cushion at the lower end of the table next to the unattractive wife of the school principal, not far from Mrs. Rinlingen, who had been led to the table by Consul Stevens. Incredible changes had occurred in little Mr. Friedemann over these 8 days. Perhaps it was partly due to the white gas lighting that filled the hall, making his face appear shockingly pale, but his cheeks falling into silence, his flushed and deeply shadowed eyes reflected an unspeakable sadness, and it seemed his figure was even more contorted than ever. He drank much wine and exchanged a few words here and there with his neighbour. Mrs. von Rinlingen had not yet exchanged a word with Mr. Friedemann at the table. Now she leaned forward slightly and called out to him, "I have waited for you in vain these days, you and your violin." He looked at her absent-mindedly for a moment before responding. She wore a light, delicate dress that revealed her white neck, and a fully bloomed Marie Chalneal rose was pinned to her radiant hair. Her cheeks were slightly flushed tonight, but as always, blue shadows rested in the corners of her eyes. Mr. Friedemann gazed down at his plate and managed to utter something in response, prompting him to the school director's question about whether he loved Beethoven. Just then, Lieutenant von Diedesheim, sitting at the top of the table, cast a glance at his wife, tapped on his glass, and said, "My lords, I suggest we drink our coffee in the other rooms. Moreover, it shouldn't be bad in the garden tonight, and if anyone wants some fresh air, I'm with them." Breaking the ensuing silence, Lieutenant von Diedesheim made a witty remark to lighten the mood, causing everyone to burst into joyful laughter. Mr. Friedemann was one of the last to leave with his lady, escorting her through the old German room where people had already begun smoking, into the semi-dark and cozy sitting area, and bidding her farewell. He was dressed with care. His tailcoat was impeccable, his shirt brilliantly white, and his slender, beautifully shaped feet were enclosed in patent leather shoes. From time to time he could be seen wearing silk stockings. Gazing down the corridor, he saw larger groups descending the stairs into the garden. Yet he sat down with his cigarette and coffee near the door of the old German room, where some gentlemen stood chatting, and looked into the sitting area. To the right of the door, a circle of people were gathered around a small table with a student in the center speaking passionately. He had asserted that one could draw more than one parallel to a line through a point. Mrs. Rechtsanwalt Hagstrom had it. This is impossible. And now he was demonstrating it so persuasively that everyone to understand. In the background of the room, on an ottoman beside the low, red shaded lamp, sat Gerda von Rinlingen in conversation with young Miss Stevens. She leaned slightly back into the yellow silk cushion, one leg over the other, slowly smoking a cigarette, exhaling the smoke through her nose and poking out her lower lip. Miss Stevens sat upright and meticulously carved before her, responding nervously with a smile. No one noticed the small misser, Friedemann, nor did they realize his large eyes were constantly fixed on Mrs. Directed from Rinlingen. He sat in a slumped posture and looked at her. There was nothing passionate in his gaze, and barely any pain. Something dull and dead lay within, a sluggish, powerless submission. About 10 minutes passed thus when suddenly Mrs. von Rillingen stood up, not looking at him as if she had secretly observed him throughout, and approached him, standing before him. He rose, looked up at her, and heard the words, "Would you like to accompany me into the garden, Miss He replied, "With pleasure, madam. XV. Have you not seen our garden yet?" She asked him on the stairs. "It is quite large." "Hopefully there are not too many people there. I would like a little fresh air. I got a headache during dinner. Perhaps this rich red wine was too strong. This door leads outside." It was a glazed door through which they entered a small, cool courtyard from the forecourt. A few steps led them to the open air. In the wonderfully starlit, warm night, the scent of all the beds permitted. The garden lay bathed in moonlight, and along the white, gleaming pebble paths, guests strolled and smoked, chatting. A group had gathered around the fountain, where the beloved old doctor, to general laughter, let paper boats float. Mrs. von Rillingen passed with a slight nod of her head, indicating in the distance where the delicate and fragrant flower garden merged into the park. "Let's go down the middle avenue," she said. At the entrance stood two low, wide obelisks. In the distance, at the end of the straight chestnut avenue, they saw the river glimmering in moonlight. All around was dark and cool. From time to time, a side path branched off that in an arc, also led to the river. No sound was heard for a long time. "By the water," she said, "there's a lovely spot where I've sat many times. We could chat there for a moment. See, sometimes a star glimmers through the leaves." He did not respond and looked at the green, shimmering expanse as they approached. They could make out the opposite bank, the wall structures. When they left the avenue and stepped onto the grass square that descended towards the river, Mrs. von Rillingen said, "Over here a little to the right is our spot. See, it's unoccupied." The bench on which they sat leaned 6 steps sideways from the avenue towards the park. It was warmer here than between the broad trees. Crickets chirped, and in the grass that hard by the water turned into thin reeds. The moonlit river cast a gentle light. They both remained silent for some time, gazing at the water. Then, however, he listened intently as the tone he had heard a week prior, this soft, contemplative, and gentle tone, touched him again. "When did you develop this affliction, Mr. Friedemann?" she asked. "Were you born with it?" He swallowed, his throat feeling constricted. Then he replied, "Here is the translation of the text, preserving the name Mann softly and politely. No, madam. As a young child I was made to fall to the ground. That's where it comes from." She asked further, "And how old are you now?" 30 years, madam," he replied. She repeated, 30 years. "And you weren't happy during these 30 years?" Herr Friedemann shook his head, and his lips trembled. "No," he said, "it was a lie and an illusion." "So you believed you were happy?" she asked. "I tried to be," he answered, and she responded. That took courage. A minute passed. Only the crickets chirped, and behind them a soft rustling could be heard in the trees. "I understand a thing or two about misfortune," she said. "Such summer nights by the water are the best for that." He did not respond immediately, but gestured weakly towards the opposite shore, lying peacefully in the darkness. "That's where I was sitting recently," he said. "When you came near me?" she asked. He simply nodded. Then suddenly he straightened up on his seat, choked up. let out a sound, a cry of lament that nevertheless had a redeeming quality, and slowly collapsed to the ground in front of her. He had touched her hand with his own, which was resting beside him on the bench. As he now held it tightly, as he took the other one, this small, completely injured person trembled and jerked on his knees before her, pressing his face into her lap. With an inhuman, gasping voice, he stammered, "Let me go. I can't any more." My God! She did not resist him. She did not bend down to him either. She sat upright, slightly leaning back, and her small, close-set eyes, reflecting the wet shimmer of the water, stared straight ahead over him into the distance. Then suddenly, with a jerk, a short, proud, scornful laugh escaped her lips as she freed her hands from his burning fingers, grabbed his arm, sent him crashing to the ground, leapt up, and disappeared down the alley. He lay there, face in the grass, stunned, dazed, and a twitch ran through his body every moment. He struggled to his feet, took 2 steps, and collapsed again. He was by the water. What exactly went through his mind at that moment? Perhaps it was this lustful hatred he felt when she humiliated him with her gaze, that now, as he lay on the ground, treated like a dog by her, a mad rage spiraled out of control within him, which he had to satisfy, even if it meant turning against himself. Maybe there was also a sense of disgust for himself, filling him with a thirst to destroy himself, tear himself apart, wipe himself out. On his stomach he pushed himself forward further and raised his upper body, letting it fall into the water. He did not raise his head again, neither did he move the legs lying on the shore for a moment. The crickets fell silent with the splashing of the water. Then here is the translation of the text. Preserving the name, Manon, she resumed her chirping. The park rustled softly, and down the long alleyway laughter rang faintly. Death. On the 10th of September. Now autumn has arrived, and summer will not return. I will never see it again. The sea is grey and still, and a fine, sorrowful rain falls. This morning, when I saw this, I bid farewell to summer and greeted autumn, my 40th autumn, which has truly come relentlessly. And relentlessly it will bring that day whose date I sometimes whisper to myself with a feeling of reverence and silent dread. The 12th of September. I took a little walk with the small Ascension. She is a good companion. She remains silent and sometimes only looks up at me with large, loving eyes. We walked along the beach path towards Crunchofen, but we turned back quite early, before encountering more than 1 or 2 people. As we retraced our steps, I was happy to see my house. How well I have chosen it. It stands simply and greyly on the hill, whose grass is now withered and damp, and whose path is muddy, overlooking the grey sea. The road passes behind it, and beyond are fields. But I don't pay attention to that. I only focus on the sea. The 15th of September. This lonely house on the hill by the sea under the grey sky is like a dark, mysterious fairy tale, and that's how I want it to be in my last autumn. However, this afternoon, as I sat at the window of my study room, there was a cart delivering supplies. The old Franz helped with unpacking, and there was noise and various voices. I can't say how disturbed I felt by this. I shuddered with disapproval. I had ordered that such things only happen early in the morning when I am sleeping. The old Franz only replied, "As you command, Lord Count." But he looked at me with his burning eyes, filled with fear and doubt. How could he understand me? He doesn't know. I don't want mundane and boring routines to touch my final days. I am afraid that death might have something civilian and ordinary about it. It should be strange and mysterious around me on that great, serious, enigmatic day on the 12th of October, the 18th of September. In recent days, I haven't gone out, but have spent most of my time on the chaise longue. I couldn't read much because all my nerves were bothering me. I simply lay still and looked out into the endless, slow rain. Assumption often came, and once she brought me flowers, a few dry and wet plants that she had found on the beach when I kissed the child in thanks. It wept because I was sick. How unbearably painful her tender and melancholy love touched me. The 21st of September. I sat for a long time in my study room at the window, and Assumption sat on my knees. We gazed out onto the grey and vast sea, and behind us in the large chamber with the high white. Here is the translation of the text while preserving the name Mandarin in the silence that reigned, broken only by the stiff furniture. I gently stroked the child's soft hair, black and flowing down her delicate shoulders. As I did so, memories flooded back to me from my tumultuous and colourful life. I recalled my quiet, sheltered youth, my travels around the world, and the brief, radiant period of my happiness. Do you remember that graceful and tender creature beneath the velvet sky of Lisbon? It has been 12 years since she gave birth to your child and passed away while her frail arm was wrapped around your neck. She had her mother's dark eyes, little Assumption, only now they are more wary and thoughtful. Above all, she has a mouth so infinitely soft, yet slightly rugged in outline, which is most beautiful when it remains silent and breaks into a quiet smile. My little Assumption, if you only knew that I must leave you, would you weep because I am sick? Oh, but what does that have to do with it? What does that have to do with October 12th? September 3rd, days when I can recall and lose myself in memories a few. How many years has it been since I've only been able to think ahead, waiting for that great and dreadful day, October 12th of my 40th year. How it will be, how it simply will be. I am not afraid, but it seems to me that this October 12th is coming agonizingly slowly. September 27th. Old Dr. Gudehaus arrived from Kronschäfen, driving along the road in his carriage and bringing a second breakfast for Assumption and me. It's necessary, he said, eating half a chicken, that you get some exercise, count, plenty of fresh air, don't read, don't think, don't brud. I consider you a philosopher, he. Well, I shrugged my shoulders and sincerely thanked him for his efforts. He also offered advice to little Assumption and regarded her with his forced and embarrassed smile. I had to increase my bromide dose. Perhaps now I can sleep a bit more. September 30th, the last day of September. It won't be long after this. It's 3 p.m, and I've calculated how many minutes are left until the start of October 12th, A460. I couldn't sleep tonight as a gust of wind arose, and the sea and rain whispered away. I lay there, letting time pass by, thinking and brooding. Oh no! Dr. Gudehaus considers me a philosopher, but my head is very weak, and all I can think about is death. Death. October 7th. Deeply moved, a feeling of triumph mixed with my movements. Sometimes when I thought about it, and people looked at me doubtfully and fearfully, I saw that they considered me mad, and I scrutinized myself with suspicion. Oh, no, I am not mad. Today I read the story of Emperor Frederick, who was prophesied to die under the flower. Well, he avoided. Cities Florence and Florentinum. Once upon a time he still came to Florentinum, and he died. Why did he die? A prophecy is in itself insignificant. It matters if it gains power over you. If it does, then it is already proven, and it will come to pass. How? And is a prophecy that rises within me and becomes strong, not more valuable than one that comes from the outside, and is the unwavering knowledge of the time when one will die less certain than the place. Oh, there is an unceasing connection between man and death. You can suck at its sphere with your will and conviction. You can summon it to come to you at the hour you believe. October 3rd. Often when my thoughts spread out like grey waters before me, seemingly infinite because they are shrouded, I see something like the connection of things and recognize the insignificance of terms. What is suicide? The voluntary death, but no one dies involuntarily. Giving up life and surrendering to death happens without distinction from weakness, and this is always a result of a body or soul illness, or both. One does not die before they are in agreement. Am I in agreement? I must be, because I believe that I could go mad if I do not die on October 12th. October 5th. I think about it unceasingly, and it occupies me entirely. I ponder when and where my knowledge came to me. I cannot say. I knew at 19 or 20 years old that I would have to die at 40, and one day, as I intensely questioned which day it would happen, then I also knew the day. And now it has come so close, so near, that I can feel the cold breath of death. October 7th. The wind has intensified, the sea roars, and the rain drums on the roof. I did not sleep during the night, but went down to the beach in my raincoat and sat there on a stone. Behind me, in darkness and rain, was the hill with the grey house where little Assumption slept, my little Assumption. And before me rolled the sea's murky foam up to my feet. I stared out all night, and it seemed to be just as death is, or what follows death, an endless, dull, roaring darkness over there and out there. Will a thought, a hint of me survive and weave forever and listen to the incomprehensible roaring? October 8th. I want to thank death when it comes, because now it will happen too soon for me to still wait. 3 more short autumn days, and it will be done. How eager I am for the last moment, the very last, should it not be a moment of delight and unspeakable sweetness, a moment of highest pleasure. 3 more short autumn days. Here is the translation of the text, while preserving the name man, and death has come to me in my room, how it will conduct itself. Will it treat me like a worm? Will it grab me by the throat and strangle me? Or will it reach into my brain with its hand? But I envision as grand and beautiful, of wild majesty. October 9th. I told Assumption, as she sat on my knees, what if I leave you soon in some way? Would you be very sad? There, she pressed her head against my chest and wept bitterly. My neck is constricted with pain. Besides, I have a fever. My head is hot, and I tremble with cold. October 10th. He was with me that night. I didn't see or hear him, but I spoke to him. It's ridiculous, but he behaved like a dentist. It's best if we do this right away, he said, but I didn't want to and resisted. In short words, I sent him away. It's best if we do this immediately. How that sounded! It went through my bones and skin. So sober, boring, so middle class. I have never known a colder or more scornful feeling of disappointment. October 11th, 11 p.m. Do I understand it? Oh! Believe me when I say I do. An hour and a half ago, as I sat in my room, the old Franz came to me. He was shivering and sobbing. The young lady, he cried, "The child? Oh, come quickly." And I came quickly. I didn't cry, and only a cold shiver ran through me. She lay in her crib. Her black hair framed her pale, pained little face. I knelt down by her and did nothing, thought nothing. Dr. Gudas came. "This is a heartbeat," he said, nodding as if it were not surprising. This fool and knave acted as if he had known it. But I understand. Oh, when I was alone with here outside, the rain and sea rustled, and the wind howled in the chimney. Then I struck the table. So clear it became to me in an instant. For 20 years, I have been bringing death forward to the day that begins in an hour, and deep inside me, something had secretly known I could not leave this child. I couldn't die after midnight, and yet it had to be. If he had come, I would have sent him away, but he went first to the child because he had to obey my knowledge and belief. Did I myself draw death to your crib? Did I kill you, my little Assumption? These are crude, wretched words for fine and mysterious things. Farewell, farewell. Perhaps I will find a thought, an inkling of you out there. For see, true, the hand is moving, and the lamp that lights up your sweet face will soon go out. I hold here is the translation of the text, preserving the name, man small, cold hand and weight. He will come to me at any moment, and I will only nod and close my eyes when I hear him say, "It's best we settle this now." The will for happiness. The old Hoffman had made his fortune as a plantation owner and in South America. He married an indigenous woman from a noble in Ferensoon, Af, to move to northern Germany, his homeland, with her. They lived in my father's city, where his entire family was also based. Paulo was born here. I never really got to know his parents anyway. In any case, Paulo resembled his mother greatly. When I saw him for the first time, that is, when our fathers brought us to school for the first time, he was a skinny little boy with a pale complexion. I still remember him. He had his black hair in long curls then, which fell wildly on the collar of his sailor suit and framed his thin face. Since we were both well off at home, we readily accepted the new environment, the bare classroom, and especially the red-bearded, shabby man who was determined to teach us our ABCs. I held my father back as he wanted to leave, weeping at his skirt, while Paulo remained completely passive. He stood motionless against the wall, squeezing his thin lips together and gazing with large, teary eyes at the other hopeful youth, who pushed into each other's sides and smiled callously. Surrounded by these larvae, we felt drawn to one another from the start and were glad when the red-bearded teacher sat us next to each other. We stuck together from then on, pooling our resources for our education, and traded daily with our butterbread. He was already sickly back then, as I remember. He would sometimes miss school for extended periods, and when he returned, his temples and cheeks showed even more clearly the pale blue veins that can often be seen in delicate brunettes. He always kept this up. That's what struck me first upon our reunion in Munich and later in Rome. Our camaraderie lasted throughout our school years for much the same reason it began. It was the pathos of distance we felt towards most of our classmates, which anyone who secretly reads Heine at 15 and passes judgment on the world and humanity in tertia knows. We even had dance classes together and shared our first love as a result. The little girl who captured his heart was a blonde, cheerful creature, and he revered her with a melancholic fervor that was remarkable for his age and sometimes seemed downright eerie to me. I remember particularly one dance class. The girl brought 2 cotillion orders to another boy consecutively, but none to him. I watched him in fear. He stood leaning against the wall next to me, staring motionless at his patent leather shoes, and suddenly collapsed into a faint. He was taken home, and he lay sick for 8 days. It turned out At that time, I believe, on this occasion, thought his heart wasn't the healthiest. Even before then, he had started drawing, developing a remarkable talent. I keep a sheet that displayfully sketched contours of that girl in charcoal, alongside the signature, "You are like a flower!" Paula Hoffman made this. I don't know exactly when it was, but we were already in upper classes when the serif to settle in Karlsruhe, where the old Hoffman had connections. Paolo wasn't supposed to change schools and was given over to an old retired professor. Nevertheless, things didn't stay that way for long. Perhaps this event, though not immediately apparent, contributed to Paulo eventually following his parents to Karlsruhe. Yeah. In a religious education class, the respective head teacher suddenly approached him with a numbing gaze, pulling out a sheet under the Old Testament that Paul was studying, depicting a nearly complete, very female figure burying herself without any shame. So Paolo went to Karlsruhe, and from time to time we exchanged postcards, a correspondence that eventually faded away completely. After our separation, approximately 5 years had passed when I met him again in Munich. One beautiful spring morning, I walked down Amalienstrasse and saw someone descending the Academy's staircase who from afar almost resembled an Italian model. As I drew closer, it was indeed him. Of medium height and slim build, with his hat pushed back on his thick black hair, he had a yellowish complexion, crossed with blue veins, dressed elegantly yet carelessly. For instance, some of the buttons on his vest weren't closed with a slightly ruffled short moustache. He approached me with a swaying, indolent gait. We recognized each other simultaneously, and the greeting was very warm. It seemed to me that while we exchanged questions about our lives over the past years at Café Minerva, he was in an elevated, almost exalted mood. His eyes shone, and his movements were large and expansive. He looked ill, truly sick. Of course, I speak easily now, but this is what I actually noticed, and I even told him directly. "Still like that?" he asked. "Yes," I replied. "I believe so. I've been very sick. Even for a long time last year, quite seriously. It's here." He gestured with his left hand to his chest. "The heart. It has always been the same. But lately I feel very good indeed, excellently. I can say that I am completely healthy, especially at my age of 23. It would be unfortunate otherwise. His mood was genuinely good. He told me joyfully and vivaciously about his life since our separation. Soon after, he insisted with his parents that he could become a painter. Finished at the Academy roughly 3/4 of a year ago, had just happened to be there by chance, had spent some time traveling, particularly in Paris, and he has been settled in Munich for approximately 5 months. Probably for a long time, who knows, perhaps forever. I asked, "Well?" He continued, "Well, yes, nas. It suits me. It pleases me greatly. The whole atmosphere, like what? The people, and not to be forgotten the social status as a painter, even an unknown one, is exquisite. It's better nowhere else." I inquired, "Have you made pleasant acquaintances?" He replied, "Yes. Few but very good ones. For example, I'd like to recommend a family to you. I met them during Carnival. The carnivals here are enchanting. They're called Stein. Even the Baron is called Berenstain. I inquired about their social standing. What kind of nobility is that? He explained the kind people call money nobility. And the Baron was a stockbroker. He had a significant role in Vienna, once mixed with all the aristocrats, and so on. And then suddenly he fell into decay, withdrew abruptly with roughly 1 million, they say, and now lives here discreetly but elegantly. I asked if he was Jewish, to which he replied Not that I know of. His wife, perhaps. By the way, I can't help but say they are extremely pleasant and refined people. Do they have children? I asked. He answered, no, that is, a 19-year-old daughter. The parents are very kind. He seemed awkward for a moment, and then added, I'm seriously suggesting that you let me introduce myself to her. It would be my pleasure. Are you not agreed? Of course, I'll be grateful. Just to meet this 19-year-old daughter, he glanced at me from the side and said, well then, let's not put it off. If it suits you, I'll pick you up tomorrow around 1 o'clock or 2:30. She lives on Theresienstrasse 25, first floor. I'm looking forward to introducing a school friend of mine to you. The matter is settled. The following day at noon, we rang the bell on the first floor of an elegant building on Theresienstrasse. Next to the doorbell was written in broad, black letters, Freiherr von Stein. Paulo had been excited and almost giggly all the way. Now, however, as we waited for the door to open, I noticed a strange change in him. Everything about him, except for a nervous twitch of his eyelid, was completely calm, a forced, tense rest. He had his head slightly tilted forward. His forehead was wrinkled. He almost resembled an animal that stiffens its ears and listens intently with all its muscles tensed. The servant who carried our cards returned and asked us to take a seat for a moment while Frau Baronin came immediately, then opened the door to a moderately large, darkly furnished room. Upon entering, a young lady in a light spring outfit rose from the bay window, which overlooked the street, stood for a moment with a searching expression, and thought to myself, as I cast an involuntary glance at my companion, the 19-year-old daughter and Baroness Ada. Here is the translation of the text, preserving the name Mann. He whispered to me. She was of elegant figure, but for her age, mature forms, and her very soft and almost sluggish movements made little impression of such a young girl. Her hair, which she had styled over her temples in 2 curls, was gleaming black and formed an effective contrast to the dull whiteness of her complexion. Although her full and moist lips, fleshy nose, and almond-shaped black eyes, above which dark and soft brows curved, left no doubt about her, at least partly Semitic descent, her face was of entirely unusual beauty. "Hi, visitors," she asked as she walked a few steps towards us. Her voice was slightly muffled. She touched her forehead with one hand as if to see better, while supporting herself on the other with the wing of the chair that stood against the wall, and even very welcome visitors. She added with the same emphasis, as if only now recognizing my friend, then she cast a questioning glance at me. Paulo approached her and bent down almost sleepily slow, giving his hand to hers, which she extended. "Madam," he said, "take the liberty of introducing to you a friend of mine, a schoolmate with whom I learned the alphabet." She also shook my hand, a soft, seemingly boneless hand without jewelry. "Delighted," she said, as her dark gaze, slightly trembling, rested on me. "And my parents will be delighted too. One hopes they've been notified." She sat down on the couch while we both sat across from her on chairs. Her white, limp hands rested in her lap during our conversation. The full sleeves barely covered her elbows. I noticed the soft joint of her wrist. After a few minutes, the door to the adjoining room opened, and her parents entered. The Baron was an elegant, stocky man with a bald head and a grey goatee. He had an unmistakable way of tucking his thick, golden bracelet back into his cuff. It wasn't certain if his elevation to free her had cost him a few syllables of his name. Nevertheless, His wife was simply a plain little Jewess in an unflattering grey dress. Large diamonds sparkled at her ears. I was introduced and received quite pleasantly, while my companion was greeted like a good friend of the family. After some questions and answers about my origins and reasons for being there, they began to speak of an exhibition where Paolo had a painting, a female nude. "A really fine piece," said the Baron. "I stood before it for half an hour the other day. The flesh tone on the red carpet is extremely effective." He patted Paolo affectionately on the shoulder. "But don't overdo it, young man. By all means not. You need to take care of yourself. How is your health? Here is the translation of the text, while preserving the name Mann. I provided the necessary insights to the lords over my person, and exchanged a few subdued words with the Baroness, who sat next to him. The strange tension I had observed in him earlier had not dissipated. He gave the impression of a spring-ready panther, without me being able to pinpoint exactly why. The dark eyes in his yellow, narrow face gleamed so unhealthily that it almost unnerved me when he answered the Baron's question with the most confident tone. "Oh, excellent! Many thanks." "I'm doing very well." After about a quarter of an hour, the Baroness reminded my friend that in two days it would be Thursday again, and not to forget her 5 o'clock tea. She also asked me at this opportunity to kindly remember this day. On the street, Paolo lit a cigarette. "So," he asked, "what do you say?" "Oh, they are very pleasant people," I quickly responded. The 19-year-old daughter even impressed me. Impressed? He laughed briefly and turned his head to the other side. "Oh, yes, you laugh," I said. "And sometimes up there I thought I saw a vaguely secret longing in your eyes, but am I mistaken?" He remained silent for a moment before slowly shaking his head. "If only I knew where you would be so kind." The question is no longer relevant to me, whether or not Ada the Baroness. He again looked silently ahead. Then he spoke softly and confidently. "I believe I will be happy," I said goodbye to him by heartily shaking his hand, though I couldn't suppress a lingering concern. A few weeks passed, during which I occasionally enjoyed afternoon tea with Paolo in the Freiherr's salon. They usually gather a small but quite pleasant circle, a young court actress, a doctor, an officer, can't remember each one individually. Nothing new emerged in Paolo's behavior. He was typically in high and cheerful spirits, despite his disconcerting appearance, and displayed that eerie calm near the Baroness which I had first noticed in him. One day, after having not seen Paolo for 2 days by chance, I encountered Baron von Stein on Ludwigstraat. He was on horseback, stopped, and extended his hand from the saddle. "Pleased to see you. Would you care to drop by tomorrow afternoon?" "Certainly, if you don't mind, Lord Baron. Although it's somehow questionable whether my friend Hoffmann will come to pick me up, as he does every Thursday." "Hoffmann? But do you not know Leff? I thought you would have informed me." "Not a word. And so completely beaten rompu. That's what they call artistic whims. So, see you tomorrow afternoon." With that, he set his horse in motion and left me utterly bewildered. I rushed to Paolo's apartment. Yes, unfortunately, Mr. Hoffmann here is the translation of the text, while preserving the name Mann he had left without a trace. He hadn't left an address. It was clear that the Baron knew more than just a spontaneous mood about his daughter. She herself confirmed to me what I had already suspected with certainty. This happened during a walk in the Isar Valley, which had been arranged, and to which I had also been invited. They had only left in the afternoon, and on their way back home late in the evening, it so happened that the Baroness and followed as follows the last couple of the group. I hadn't noticed any change in her since Paolo's disappearance. She had maintained her composure entirely and never mentioned my friend until then, while her parents expressed regret over his sudden departure. We walked side by side through one of the most beautiful parts of Munich's surroundings. Moonlight flickered between the leaves, and we listened silently to the chatter of the rest of the company, which was as monotone as the rushing water nearby. Then she suddenly began speaking about Paolo in a very calm and confident tone. Was he a friend since his youth? She asked me. Yes, my lady, I replied. Do you share his secrets? I believe his greatest secret is known to me, even without him telling me. And can I trust you? I hope you don't doubt it, kind miss. She nodded resolutely and continued. He asked for my hand, but my parents refused. They told me he was sick, very sick, but anyway, I love him. Is it all right if I speak to you like this? I am not sure. She paused momentarily before continuing with the same determination. He don't know where he is, but I give you permission to repeat my words, which he has already heard from me, as soon as you see him, to write to him as soon as you find his address. I will never marry anyone else except him. We'll see. This last exclamation held not only defiance and determination, but also a helpless pain that prevented me from taking her hand and silently squeezing it. At that time, I wrote to Hofmann's parents, asking them to inform me about their son's whereabouts. I received an address in South Tyrol, and my letter, which was sent there, returned to me with a note saying that the recipient had left the place without specifying his travel destination. He wanted to be undisturbed. He had fled from everything to die somewhere in solitary solitude, to die. After all this, it had become a sad certainty for me that I would not see him again. Wasn't it clear that this desperately ill man loved that young girl with a silent, volcanic, glowing, sensual passion, matching the same, his initial stirring stir of his former youth? The sick man's egoistic instinct had ignited the desire for union with thriving health in him, but as this flame remained unquenched, it consumed. Here is the English translation of the text. Preserving the name, man, didn't I conserve my last remaining strength? And 5 years passed without a single sign of life from him, but neither did the news of his death reach me. Last year I was in Italy, in Rome and its surroundings. I had spent the hot months in the mountains, returned to the city at the end of September, and on a warm evening I sat sipping tea at the Café Aranjo. I flipped through my newspaper and looked aimlessly at the bustling scene within the vast, illuminated room. Guests came and went, waiters hurried back and forth, and from time to time the long-drawn cries of the paper boys echoed through the wide, open doors into the hall. And suddenly I saw a gentleman of my own age moving slowly between the tables, heading towards an exit. That walked. But he turned his head towards me as he did, raised his eyebrows, and approached me with a joyful, surprised, "Ah!" He exclaimed, "You here?" We called out in unison, and he added, so we're both still alive. His eyes drifted slightly while saying this. He had barely changed in 5 years. Perhaps his face had become slimmer, and his eyes deeper in their sockets. He would take deep breaths from time to time. "Have you been in Rome for long?" he asked. "Not in the city for long. I spent a few months in the countryside." "And you?" "I was at the sea until last week. I've always preferred the mountains." Yes, since we last met, I've discovered some fine land. He started to tell me about how he had spent those 5 years traveling, constantly on the move. He roamed through the Tiroler mountains, slowly traversed all of Italy, went from Sicily to Africa, and spoke of Algiers, Tunis, Egypt. Eventually I was in Germany for a while. He said, in Karlsruhe. My parents desperately wanted to see me and reluctantly let me go again. Now I've been back in Italy for a quarter year. I feel at home in the south, you know. Rome pleases me more than anything. I hadn't asked him about his health yet. So I said, from all this, I conclude that your health has significantly improved. He looked at me questioningly for a moment before replying, You mean because I'm so lively and out and about? Oh, let me tell you, that's a very natural need. What do you want? Drinking, smoking, loving the forbidden, all that to me I need some kind of narcotic, understand? When I remained silent, he added, for 5 years very necessary. We had reached the point we had avoided up until then, and the pause that followed spoke of our mutual bewilderment. He sat back against the velvet cushion and looked up at the chandelier. Then suddenly he said, above all, here is the translation of the text, preserving the name Mann. Isn't it true? You forgive me for not having contacted you in such a long time. Do you understand? Of course, he replied. Are you aware of my experiences in Munich? He continued, speaking almost harshly. As fully as possible. And do you know that I've been carrying out a mission for you the entire time? A commission from a lady. His wary eyes flickered briefly. Then, in the same dry and sharp tone as before, he said, Tell me if there's anything new. Not much, just a confirmation of what you already heard from her. And I repeated to him, amidst the chattering and gesticulating crowd, the words that the Baroness had spoken to me that evening. He listened, running his hand slowly through his brow. Then he said, without any sign of movement, Thank you. His tone began to bother me. But these words have passed through years. I said, 5 long years that she and you both went through. Thousands of new impressions, feelings, thoughts, wishes. I stopped because he stood up and spoke with a voice that again vibrated with passion, which I had momentarily thought was extinguished. I hold on to these words. In that moment, I recognized on his face and in his entire posture the expression I had observed on him at the time when I was supposed to meet the Baroness for the first time, this forced, strained calmness that a predator shows before the leap. I changed the subject, and we spoke once more about his travels, about the studies he made along the way. There didn't seem to be many. He expressed himself rather indifferently on the matter. Just after midnight, he stood up. I'd like to go to sleep, or perhaps be alone. You'll find me in the Doria Gallery tomorrow morning. I'm copying Saraceni. I've fallen in love with the musical angel. Do come by. I'm very glad you're here. Good night. And he left slowly and calmly, with slack, languid movements. For the entire next month, I explored the city with Mann, Rome, this exceptionally rich museum of all arts, this modern metropolis in the south, this city brimming with loud, rapid, hot, thoughtful life, yet where the warm wind carries over the sweltering lethargy of the east. Mann's behavior remained constant throughout. He was usually serious and quiet, and sometimes he would sink into a floppy fatigue, only to suddenly come back to life as his eyes lit up, eager to continue a calm conversation. One day, I must mention, when he let slip some words that have only now taken on full meaning for me. It was on a Sunday. We had used the wonderful late summer morning for a walk along the Via Appia, and now rested on that small hill surrounded by cypresses, from which one enjoys a delightful view of the sunny countryside with its great aqueduct and the Alban Mountains. Here is the translation of the text, preserving the name Man enshrouded in a soft mist. Paolo lay half reclined, his chin resting on his hand, beside me on the warm grass floor, gazing with wary, masked eyes into the distance. Then again came that sudden surge from complete apathy as he turned towards me. This atmospheric condition. The atmosphere is everything. I muttered in agreement, and silence fell. Suddenly, without any transition, he said, turning his face towards mine with a certain intensity, "By the way, haven't you noticed that I'm still alive?" I remained speechless, struck by his words, and he looked away again with a thoughtful expression. "Me, yes," he continued slowly. "I'm surprised every day that I'm still here. Do you actually know how I am? The French doctor in Algiers told May the devil understand how you can still be traveling. I advise you to go home and get into bed. He was always so direct, as we played dominoes together every evening. I'm still alive. I'm almost at my wit's end every day. At night I lie in darkness, on my right side, for heaven's sake. My heart pounds up to my throat. I feel dizzy from fear, and then suddenly it feels like death has touched me. It's as if everything inside me stops for a moment. My heartbeat pauses, my breathing fails. I sit up, turn on the light, take a deep breath, look around, devouring all objects with my gaze. Then I drink a glass of water and lie down, always on my right side. Slowly, I fall asleep. I sleep very deeply and for a very long time, because I'm usually exhausted anyway. Do you think I could just lay here and die if I wanted to? I believe I've faced death 1,000 times in these years. I haven't died yet. Something holds me back. I sit up, think of something, cling to a sentence I repeat to myself 20 times while my eyes greedily devour all the light and life around me. Do you understand me? He lay motionless, hardly expecting an answer. I can't remember what I said in response, but I'll never forget the impact his words had on me. And now that day, it feels like it was just yesterday. It was one of those first autumn days, those grey, unnervingly warm days, when the damp, oppressive wind from Africa blows through the streets, and in the evening the entire sky lights up constantly with weather lightning. In the morning I visited Paulo to pick him up for an outing. His large suitcase stood in the middle of the room. Closet and dresser were wide open, his watercolor sketches from the East, and the plaster cast of the Vatican youth's head were still in their places. He himself stood upright by the window, unmovingly gazing out as I stood there, astonished. Then he turned briefly, stretched out a letter to me, and said nothing but, "Read." I looked at him. On that thin, yellowish sickbed face, with the black, feverish eyes, lay an expression capable of being produced only by death, an appalling solemnity which made my eyes fall upon the letter I had taken from him. And I read, "Dear Mr. Hoffman, thanks to the kindness of your esteemed parents, to whom I addressed myself, I have gained knowledge of your address, and now hope these lines will be kindly received by you. Allow me, dear Mr. Hoffman, to assure you that during these 5 years I have always thought of you with a feeling of sincere friendship. If I were to assume that your sudden departure on that day so painful for both you and me should express anger towards me and my family, my sorrow would be even greater than the shock and profound astonishment I felt when you asked for my daughter's hand. I spoke to you then as one to another, openly and honestly, at risk of appearing brutally, explained the reason why I had to refuse a man whom I hold in every respect so highly, and I spoke to you as a father who has his only child's lasting happiness in mind and would have deliberately thwarted any conscious wishes on both sides if he had ever allowed himself to consider their possibility. In the same qualities, my esteemed Mr. Hofmann, I speak to you today as a friend and as a father. 5 years have passed since your departure, and up until then did not have enough reflection to realize how deeply the inclination you managed to instill in my daughter had taken root in her. But recently an event occurred that totally opened my eyes. Why should I keep from you that my daughter rejected the hand of a highly respectable suit whose proposal as a father I could only strongly encourage? The feelings and wishes of my daughter have been powerless before the years, and if this is an open and modest question, the same thing holds true for you, dear Mr. Hoffmann. Then I declare to you herewith that we parents do not want to stand in the way of our child's happiness. I am looking forward to your reply, whatever it may be, for which I will be extremely grateful, and I have nothing to add to these lines except my fullest respect. Sincerely, Baron Oscar von Stein. I looked up. He had his hands on his back and turned away from the window again. I asked nothing but, "You're leaving?" And without looking at me, he replied, "My things need to be ready by early tomorrow morning." The day passed with errands and packing my bags, in which I assisted him, and later that evening, on my suggestion, we took one last joint stroll through the city streets. It was still unbearably humid. The sky twitched every second with a fierce phosphorescent light. Paolo seemed calm and wary, yet he breathed deeply and heavily. In silence or casual conversation, we wandered for perhaps an hour before stopping at the Fontana Trevi, that famous fountain depicting the racing chariot of the sea god. Wigan gazed long and admiringly at this splendid, sweeping group, played upon unceasingly by a vivid blue light, creating almost a magical impression. My companion said, "Of course, Bernini still delights me even in his students' works. I don't understand his enemies. Indeed, if the Last Judgment is more carved there than painted, then all of Bernini's works are more painted than carved. Who is a greater decorator?" "Do you actually know?" I asked. The story behind the fountain. Whoever drinks from it upon leaving Rome will return. And I handed him my travel glass, filling it with one of the water jets. "You shall see Rome again." He took the glass and brought it to his lips. At that moment, the entire sky burst into a dazzling, long-lasting fire show, and the thin vessel shattered at the edge of the basin. Paolo dried the water on his suit with a handkerchief. "I'm nervous and clumsy," he said. "Let's go on." Hopefully the glass wasn't valuable. The next morning the weather had cleared. A light blue summer sky laughed down on us as we drove to the station. Goodbye was brief. Paolo silently shook my hand as I wished him luck, lots of luck. I watched him for a long time as he stood tall at the wide viewing window. Deep seriousness lay in his eyes and triumph. What more is there to say? He is dead. He died on the morning after the wedding night, almost during the wedding night. It had to be this way. Wasn't it the sole will for happiness with which he had defeated death for so long? He had to die without fight or resistance when his will for happiness was satisfied. He no longer had an excuse to live. I wondered if he had acted badly, deliberately badly towards the one he chose to marry. But I saw her at his funeral, standing over his coffin, and in her face I recognized the expression I found on his, the solemn and powerful seriousness of triumph, disappointment. I must admit that the speeches of this strange man utterly confused me, and I fear that even now I am not able to repeat them in such a way that they would touch others as they touched me that evening. Perhaps their effect was merely due to the unsettling openness which an entirely unknown person delivered them to me. The autumn morning when I first noticed that stranger on Piazza San Marco is now about 2 months past. On the vast square, only a few people moved around, but before the colourful wonder building whose lush and fairy tale outlines and golden embellishments sparkled in here, is the translation of the text, preserving the name in the enchanting clarity of a delicate, light blue sky. The flags fluttered gently in the sea breeze. Right before the main portal, a huge flock of doves had gathered around a young girl scattering corn, and more kept flying in from all sides, a sight of unparalleled brightness and festive beauty. That's when I met him, and as I write this, he is still vividly in my mind. He was of average height, walking quickly with a bent posture while holding his cane with both hands on his back. He wore a black, stiff hat, a bright summer overcoat, and dark, striped trousers. For some reason, I took him to be an Englishman. He could have been in his early 30s, or even mid-50s. His face, with a slightly thicker nose and wary-looking grey eyes, was shaved, and a peculiar, almost stupid smile constantly played around his mouth. Occasionally, he would look around curiously by raising his eyebrows, then return his gaze to the ground, mutter to himself, shake his head, and smile again. He persistently walked up and down the square. From that day on, I observed him daily, as it seemed all he did was walk across the piazza, rain or shine, in the morning or afternoon, 30 or 50 times a day, always alone and with the same strange behavior. On the evening I am thinking of, a military band had given a concert. I was sitting at one of the small tables that Cafe Florian extends out onto the square, and as the crowd that had been streaming back and forth until then began to disperse after the concert ended, the stranger, smiling absent-mindedly as always, took a seat at a table next to mine. Time passed and silence fell all around. Soon every table was empty, and only here and there would someone pass by. A majestic peace hung over the square. The sky was covered with stars, and half the moon shone above the magnificent theatrical facade of St. Mark's Basilica. I was reading my newspaper while turning away from my neighbour, when I felt compelled to half turn towards him, because until then I had not even heard a movement from him. Suddenly he began to speak. "Are you in Venice for the first time, sir?" he asked in poor French, and as I tried to answer him in English, he continued speaking in dialect Free German with a soft, hoarse voice that he often cleared by coughing. "Is all this new to you? Does it meet your expectations? Does it even surpass them? Ah! Didn't you imagine it more beautiful? Is that really the case? Do you not say so just to seem happy and enviable?" He leaned back and looked at me with quick blinks and a completely incomprehensible expression. Here is the translation of the text, preserving the name Mann. A pause fell, lasting a long time, and not knowing how to continue this strange conversation. I was about to rise again when he suddenly bent forward. "Do you know what that is, my lord?" he whispered urgently, leaning on his cane with both hands. "Not a failure in the small or individual, but the great general disappointment, the disappointment that life presents to us all." he asked, knowing I hadn't experienced it. I've been walking alongside it since my youth, and it has left me lonely, unhappy, and somewhat peculiar. I won't deny it. How could you understand me yet, my lord? Perhaps, if I may ask, by listening to me for just 2 minutes. For if it can be said quickly, so too can it be done. Let me mention that I grew up in a tiny town in a parsonage, where the pristine rooms were filled with an antiquated, pathetic, scholarly optimism, and one breathed in a peculiar atmosphere of pulpit rhetoric, those grand words for good and evil, beauty and ugliness, which I loathe so bitterly as they may bear sole responsibility for my suffering. My life was made up of these grand words, as I knew nothing but the immense, formless intuitions that these words stirred within me. I expected the divine goodness and the horrifying divorce from people, awaited the enchanting beauty and the hideousness from life. A desire for all of it consumed me, a deep, fearful longing for the vast reality, for experience of any kind after the intoxicatingly glorious happiness and the unspeakably, unconceivably terrifying suffering. I remember, my lord, with a sad clarity, the first disappointment of my life, and I ask you to note that it was not a failure of a beautiful hope, but rather the onset of misfortune. I was barely a child when a nocturnal fire broke out in my father's house. The fire had stealthily and treacherously until my room door was ablaze and the whole small floor was on fire. The staircase was not far from catching flame as well. I was the first to notice it, and I know that I raced through the house, shouting once over the other, "It's burning! It's burning!" I recall this word with great precision, and I also know what feeling underlie it, though it may not have been fully conscious at the time. This, I felt, was a conflagration. Now I am experiencing it. Is it any worse? Is that all? God knows it wasn't trifling. The entire house burned down. We all barely escaped certain danger, and I myself suffered significant injuries. It would also be wrong to say that my imagination had anticipated the events and painted a more terrifying picture of my parents' home on fire. But a vague intuition, an unformed notion of something even more horrifying dwelt within me, and in comparison. Here is the translation of the text, preserving the name man. So it appeared to me that reality was dim. The firestorm was my first great experience. A terrible hope was thus dashed. Do not fear that I will continue to tell you about my disappointments in detail. I will content myself with saying that I nurtured my grand expectations of life with unhappy zeal through thousands of books, through the works of poets. I have learned to hate these poets who write their grandiose words on every wall and would like to paint them on the sky dome with a cedar dipped in Vesuvius, while I cannot help but feel that every grand word is a lie or a mockery. Mad poets sang to me about how poor language was. How poor. Oh no, my lord. Language seems rich to me, excessively so, compared to the meagreness and limitations of life. Pain has its boundaries, physical helplessness in paralysis, spiritual stupor in idiocy. It is the same with happiness. However, human communication needs have invented sounds that fly beyond these boundaries. Is it my fault? Does only my interpretation make certain words run down my spine, evoking presages of experiences that do not even exist? I ventured into the famous realm, yearning for one experience, one event that would correspond to my grand expectations. May God help me, it was not granted to me. I traveled to visit the most celebrated places on earth, stood before artistic masterpieces where humanity dances with its greatest words. I gazed at them and thought, it is beautiful. Yet, isn't there something more? Is this all there is? I have no sense of reality that says it all. Once upon a time, in some place in the world, I stood on a mountain gazing into a deep, narrow gorge. The rock walls were barren and vertical, and below the water roared past the blocks. I looked down and thought, what if I fell? But I had enough experience to answer myself. If it happened, I would speak to myself in the situation. Now you're falling, now it's real. What is reality then? Do you believe me when I say I've had enough experiences to have something to contribute? Years ago, I loved a girl, a delicate and lovely creature that I wanted to lead by my side and under my protection. But she didn't love me, which was no surprise, and another could protect her. Is there an experience more painful than this harsh trial mixed with lust? I've lain awake many nights, and sadder, more agonizing than anything else was always the thought, this is the great pain. Now I am experiencing it. What is reality then? Is it necessary for me to also tell you about my luck? Because I have experienced luck too, and even that has disappointed me. It's not necessary, because these are all crude examples that will make sense to you. Here is the translation of the text, preserving the name man. I will not make clear that it is life as a whole, and in general that has disappointed me, life in its mediocre, uninteresting, and dull course. What is man? Writes young Werther once, the celebrated half-god. Does he not lack just there the powers he most needs? And when he soars with joy or sinks into suffering, isn't he halted there, returned to that dull, cold awareness, after which he longed to lose himself in the fullness of the infinite? I often recall the day I first beheld the sea. The sea is vast. The sea is wide. My gaze wandered from the shore, hoping to be free, but there was the horizon in the distance. Why do I have an horizon? I expected life to be endless. Perhaps my horizon is narrower than others. I've said that I lack a sense of reality, or I perhaps have too much of one. Can I not wait any longer? Am I finishing too quickly? Do I only know happiness and pain in the lowest, most diluted states? I do not believe it, and I do not believe people. I believe the least of them, those who, faced with life, echo the grand words of Poetsit, is cowardice and a lie. By the way, have you noticed, my lord, that there are people so vain and for the admiration and covert envy of others that they claim to have only experienced the grand words of happiness, not those of suffering. It's dark and you're barely listening to me anymore. That's why I want to confess once more today that I too, myself, once tried to lie with these people, presenting myself and others as happy. But it's been a few years since this vanity collapsed, and I have become lonely, unhappy, and a little peculiar. I will not deny it. My favorite pastime is gazing at the night sky full of stars. Isn't the best way to look down on earth and life? And perhaps it's forgivable that I make it a point to at least preserve my intuitions, to dream of a freed life where reality dissolves into my grand intuitions without the painful remainder of disappointment. A life with no horizon, that I dream of, and I await death. I already know it so well, this final disappointment. That is death, I will tell myself in the last moment. Now I am experiencing it. But what does that actually mean? But it has grown cold here, my lord. I can feel it. I recommend myself to you most warmly. Goodbye. The buffoon. In conclusion, as a fitting finale, after all this, it's the disgust that life, my life, all of this has instilled in me. The whole thing and other reflections by man, this revulsion, this loathing that chokes me, drives me wild, shakes me to my core, and throws me down again, and perhaps it will give me the necessary momentum in the end to break through this ridiculous, meaningless situation and leave it behind. It's very possible I'll drag this out for another month or two, maybe a quarter or half year of eating, sleeping, and going through the motions, all in the same mechanical, well-oiled, tranquil way as my external life during this winter, which stood in stark contrast to the chaotic disintegration of my inner self. Doesn't it seem that a person's internal experiences grow stronger and more compelling as they live an exterior life that is more detached, worldly, and peaceful? It's no use. One must live. And if you resist becoming an active force and retreat to the most serene solitude, the vicissitudes of existence will still strike at your core, and you'll have to prove yourself in them whether you're a hero or a fool. I've compiled this neat notebook to tell my story. Hero, why? Perhaps just to have something to do. Out of a fascination with psychology, maybe to indulge in the necessity of all that. The necessity is so comforting, or perhaps to enjoy moments of feeling superior and indifferent about myself. For indifference would be a kind of happiness. Far away, that little old town with its narrow, winding streets, its Gothic churches and fountains, its bustling, solid, simple people, and the grand, ancient patrician house where I grew up. It stood in the heart of the city and had housed 4 generations of wealthy and esteemed merchants. Aurit Labra was inscribed over the door, and to reach the drawing-room where my mother sat at the piano, one had to pass through a vast, stone-tiled entryway, climb a wide staircase, cross a spacious courtyard, and walk through a small, dimly lit columned hall, passing one of the tall white doors. My mother sat in dim light, because heavy, dark red curtains hung before the windows, and the white figures of the tapestries seemed to leap from their blue background, listening intently to those heavy, deep-opening chords of a Chopin nocturne she loved above all else, and always played very slowly, savoring each accord's melancholy. The piano was old and lacked full tonal richness, but with the piano pedal which muffled the high notes, turning them into dull silver, one could produce the strangest effects. I sat on the massive, stiff damask sofa and listened to my mother while observing her. She was small and delicate, usually wearing a dress of soft, light grey fabric. Her narrow face was unattractive, but under her sleek, slightly wavy blonde hair it resembled a quiet, tender child's face, a dreamlike quality that lingered even as she tilted her head a little to the side. Translated text tenderly, she played the piano with a grace that reminded me of the small, touching angels often depicted at the feet of the Madonna with her guitar. When I was young, she would tell me stories in her soft and reserved voice, tales no one else knew, or she'd simply rest her hands on my head as it lay in her lap, sitting silently and unmoving. Those seemed to be the happiest and most peaceful hours of my life. Her hair never turned grey, and she appeared ageless to me. Her figure grew only more delicate, her face narrower, quieter, and daydreamy. My father, on the other hand, was a tall and broad man in a fine black coat with a white vest adorned with a golden monocle. Between his short ice-grey waistcoat buttons, his chin emerged round and strong, shaven as smooth as his upper lip. Between his eyebrows, 2 deep vertical wrinkles always formed. He was a powerful figure with great influence over public affairs. I've seen people leave him gasping and with shining eyes, others broke and utterly desperate. Sometimes my mother, my two older sisters, and I would witness such scenes, perhaps because my father wanted constituency ambition in me to achieve as much as he had, or maybe, as I suspect, because he needed an audience. He had a way of leaning back in his chair, one hand tucked into the fold of his coat, observing the lucky or doomed individuals with a gaze that made me, even as a child, suspicious. I sat in a corner, contemplating my father and mother as if choosing between them, pondering whether to spend life in dreamy contemplation or action and power. Eventually my eyes rested on my silent mother's face. Even though I wasn't like her in outward demeanor, my pursuits were far from quiet, and still remember one in particular that I preferred over socializing with peers and their games. It still fills me with joy and amusement even now, as I casually reach my 30th year. It involved a large and well-appointed puppet theatre that I locked myself into my room to perform peculiar music dramas with. My room on the second floor, with two dark ancestral portraits of Wallenstein, style beds hanging on the walls, was darkened, and a lamp placed beside the theatre. Artificial lighting seemed necessary for the mood. I took my place directly in front of the stage because I was the conductor, and my left hand rested on a large round cardboard box, the only visible orchestra instrument. The participating artists, which I had drawn cut out and provided with wooden stands, arrived men in overcoats and cylinders, and ladies of great beauty. "Good evening," I said. "My lords, all well, I hope." At the scene, there still being some arrangements to make, it was time to retire to the dressing rooms. They proceeded to the ones behind the stage and soon returned, transformed into colourful theatrical characters through the hole I had cut in the curtain to inform them of the house's seating plan. The house was indeed well filled, and I gave the signal for the performance to begin, raising my baton and enjoying a moment of the profound silence it evoked. Shortly after, with a new movement, the anticipatory dull rumble of drums began, marking the start of the overture, which I played with my left hand on a cardboard box. The trumpets, clarinets, and flutes, whose tonal character I mimicked in an unparalleled way, took their places, and the music continued until, at a powerful crescendo, the curtain rose, unveiling either a dark forest or a brilliant hall where the drama unfolded. It was all conceived in advance, but had to be improvised detail by detail. What echoed as passionate and sweet songs, with clarinets trilling and the cardboard box rumbling, were strange, full-bodied verses brimming with grand and bold words that only occasionally made logical sense. The opera progressed while I drummed with my left hand, sang and conducted with my mouth, and directed everything else with my right, resulting in enthusiastic applause after each act. The curtain had to be opened again, and sometimes the conductor even had to turn around in his seat and graciously thank everyone for their standing ovation. Truly, when I packed up my theatre after such an exhausting performance with a burning head, a feeling of happy exhaustion washed over me, the same sort of satisfaction a powerful artist feels upon successfully completing a work that demanded their best efforts. This game remained my favourite pastime until I was 13 or 14 years old. My childhood and boyhood passed in the grand house where my father ran his business on the lower floors, while my mother dreamt or played piano quietly and contemplatively upstairs. My two older sisters handled kitchen chores and laundry in the rooms above. I remember so little. One thing is certain, I was a remarkably cheerful boy who won respect and popularity among my peers thanks to my privileged background, exemplary imitation of teachers, 1,001 theatrical pieces, and an elite style of speech. However, school was not easy for me because I was too busy discovering the comedy in my teachers to pay attention to anything else, and at home, with opera themes, verses, and colourful nonsense crowding my mind, I wasn't capable of serious work. "Pooh," said my father. Here is the translation, preserving the name Mann. The wrinkles between his eyebrows deepened as I brought him my report card into the living room after lunch, and he had scanned the paper, hand in his pocket, with a flick of his wrist. "You don't make me very happy, that's for sure," he said. "What will become of you if you have the kindness to tell me this? You'll never get to the surface of things." It was disheartening, but it didn't stop me from reading a poem I'd written during the afternoon to my parents and sisters after dinner, a poem I'd crafted while sitting in the evening light. My father laughed, his pinchin jumping on the white waistcoat as he did so. "What nonsense!" he exclaimed at one point. My mother, however, pulled me close, smoothed my hair from my brow, and said, "It's not bad at all, my boy. I think there are some nice bits in it, Bob." Later, when I was a bit older, I learned to play the piano on my own. I started by grasping chords in F major because I found the black keys especially alluring, worked on transitions to other keys, and eventually, as I spent long hours at the piano, developed a certain skill in the seamless shift between harmonies without rhythm or melody, imbuing this mystical fog with as much expression as possible. My mother said, "He has a touch that reveals taste." She arranged for lessons that continued for half a year because I was really not cut out for learning proper fingerings and timing. Well, the years passed, and I grew up immensely joyful despite the worries school caused me. I moved with a cheerful spirit among my acquaintances and relatives, and I was versatile and lickable because I enjoyed playing the charming fellow, although I began to despise these dry and unimaginative people from an instinctive place. One afternoon when I was about 18 years old, and on the cusp of high school, I overheard a short conversation between my parents in the living room at the round sofa table. They didn't know I was listening intently from the adjoining dining room, motionless by the window, gazing up at the pale sky over the roof lines. When I recognized my name, I cautiously approached the half-open white piano door. My father sat in his chair, reclined, one leg over the other, holding a stock market paper on his knees, while he slowly stroked his chin with the other hand. My mother sat on the sofa, her face turned away from the light, engrossed in some embroidery. The lamp stood between them. "I think we should remove him from school soon," my father said, "and put him into an apprenticeship at a large business." "Oh," my mother replied sadly, looking up. Such a gifted child. My father fell silent for a moment, carefully blowing away a dust particle from his coat. Then he raised his shoulders, spread his arms, and he held both of his mother's palm in front of him and said, "If you assume that no talent belongs to the activity of a merchant, this notion is mistaken. On the other hand, the boy, as I sadly realize more and more, brings nothing to school. His talent, of which you speak, is a kind of bizarre talent. I hasten to add that I do not underestimate such things. He can be charming when he feels like it. He understands how to deal with people, entertain them, flatter them. He has the need to please and succeed. With such predisposition, many have made their way in life, and it makes him relatively suitable for a merchant of his style, despite his indifference otherwise. My father leaned back satisfied, took a cigarette from his case, and lit it slowly. "You are certainly right," said my mother, looking around the room sadly. "I often thought and almost hoped that he could become an artist. It is true that we cannot rely on his musical talent, which remains undeveloped, but have you noticed that lately, since he visited the small art exhibition, he has been drawing a bit? It's not bad at all, I think." My father blew out the smoke, straightened himself in the chair, and said briefly, "Al, this is clownery and trickery. Besides, one can ask him as cheaply as possible according to his wishes." Well, what wishes could I possibly have? The prospect of changing my outer life was indeed exhilarating to me. I declared myself ready in all seriousness to leave school to become a merchant, and started an apprenticeship at Miss Schlievok's large lumber business located downstream from the river. The change was entirely external, of course. My interest in Monsieur Schlievok's large lumber business was minimal, and I sat on my swivel chair under the gas flame in the narrow and dark counter as alien and absent. Minded as I had once been on the school bench, I had fewer worries now. That was the difference. Monsieur Schlievok, a stout man with a red face and a grey, hard beard, paid little attention to me because he was usually at the sawmill, which was quite far from the counter and storage area. The store's employees treated me respectfully. In friendly communication, I only stood in touch with one of them, a talented and amused young man from a good family whom I had known since school, and who was named Stilling. He mocked everyone just like me, but also showed an avid interest in the lumber trade, never missing opportunity to express his specific intent to become rich in some way or another. As for me, I dealt with my necessary matters mechanically while spending the rest of my time wandering among the pile of planks and workers on the storage yard, watching the river through the high wooden fence, where every now and then a goods train would pass by. While contemplating a theatre performance or concert I had attended or a book I had read, I spent much time reading, devouring everything within reach, and my comprehension was vast. Every poetic figure I encountered I understood with a sense of recognition, as if they were myself, and thought and felt in their style, until a new influence took hold of me. In the room where I once set up my puppet theatre, I now sat on my knees with a book, gazing at the two ancestral portraits above me, to absorb the tone of the language I had embraced, while an unproductive chaos of thoughts and fantasy images filled me. My sisters had married in quick succession, and I often descended into the living room when I wasn't working, where my mother, who was slightly ill, now sat alone. When she played Chopin for me, and I showed her a new idea for harmonic connections, she might have asked if I was satisfied with my profession and happy. There was no doubt that I was happy. I was not much older than 20 years old. My life situation was provisional, and it wasn't strange to me that I wasn't compelled to spend my life with Miss Schlievok or in a woodshop of greater style, that one day I could free myself to leave the Gable City and live according to my inclinations, reading good, well-written novels, going to the theatre, making some music. Happy. But I ate excellently, dressed impeccably, and from an early age, when I saw, for instance, during my school days, how poor and badly dressed classmates routinely ducked their heads at me, and those like me with a sort of flattering shyness acknowledged us as lords and leaders, I had been cheerful about knowing that I belonged to the upper classes. The rich, the envied, who now had the right to look down on the poor, unfortunate, and envious with benevolent scorn. How could I not be happy? Let everything take its course. For the moment it was appealing to move among these relatives and acquaintances, feeling foreign, superior, and cheerful, mocking their limitations while charming them out of habit and basking in the vague respect they showed for my existence and nature, because they sensed something opposing and eccentric in me. A change began to take place with my father. When he came table at 4 o'clock, the wrinkles between his eyebrows seemed deeper each day, and he no longer gestured imposingly by pushing his hand into his pants pocket, but showed a subdued, nervous, and timid demeanor. One day he said to me, "You are old enough to share the worries that are undermining my health. By the way, I have a duty to introduce you to them, so that do not allow yourself to harbor false expectations about your future. You know that the marriages of your sisters required significant sacrifices. Recently, the company has suffered losses substantial enough to drastically reduce its wealth. I am old, feel discouraged, and do not believe that the situation will change significantly. I ask you to note that you will be on your own." This is what he said about 2 months before his death. One day they found him pale, paralyzed, and mumbling in his armchair at his private office. A week later, the entire city attended his funeral. My mother sat gently and silently on the sofa by the round table in the living room, her eyes mostly closed. Whenever my sisters and I tried to comfort her, she might nod, she'd nod and smile, before returning to silence and stillness, her hands folded in her lap, gazing intently at a figure of a god from the wallpaper with a distant and sorrowful look. When the gentleman in formal attire came to report on the progress of the liquidation, she would nod again and close her eyes once more. She no longer played Chopin, and whenever she stroked her hair softly, her pale, delicate, and tired hand trembled. Just half a year after my father's death, she lay down, and she passed away without a moan or a struggle for her life. Now everything was over. What kept me at that place? The business had been settled, whether well or poorly, and it turned out that I had inherited about 100,000 marks, which was enough to make me independent from everyone, all the more so as they had declared me unfit for military service for some indifferent reason. Nothing tied me any more to the people among whom I had grown up. Their stares always seemed stranger and more astonished to me, and their world-view to one-sided for me to be inclined to conform to it. Admittedly, they knew me right as an utterly useless person, just as I knew myself, but skeptical and fatalistic enough to take, in my father's words, the jester talent from its cheerful side, and cheerfully willing to enjoy life in my own way. I lacked nothing in self-satisfaction. I raised my modest fortune, and almost without saying goodbye, I left the city, setting off on a journey for the time being. Why? These 3 years that followed, during which I immersed myself with eager receptiveness in 1,000 new, changing, rich impressions, I remember as a beautiful, distant dream. How long ago was it since I spent New Year's Eve among the monks at Simplon, between snow and ice, since I strolled through Verona's Piazza Erba, since I first stepped under the columns of St. Peter from Borgo San Spirito, and my frightened eyes got lost in the immense square, since I looked down over Naples from Corso Vittorio Emanuele, its white, shimmering surface, and far away. Here is the translation of the text, preserving the name Mann. I saw the graceful silhouette of Capri fading into blue mist. It has been 6 years, or perhaps even less. Oh, I lived a cautious life, befitting my station in simple private rooms in comfortable pensions. Due to frequent moves and the initial difficulty of breaking away from my bourgeois habits, however, larger expenses were inevitable. I had set aside 15,000 marks from my capital for the duration of my wanderings, yet this sum was exceeded. On the whole, though, I found myself among people with whom I came into contact here and there during my travels, some uninteresting and others quite fascinating. I was not considered a subject of respect in the way I once was in my former circle, but neither did I fear strange glances or questions from them. Thanks to my social talents, I sometimes enjoyed genuine popularity among the other travellers in pensions, as I vividly recall in the salon of the Manelli pension in Palermo. Surrounded by a group of Frenchmen of varying ages, I had begun improvising a music drama by Richard Wagner on the piano, employing exaggerated tragic facial expressions, declamatory singing, and rolling harmonies, and just as I finished to great applause, and an elderly gentleman approached me, almost bald, with only a few white strands remaining on his head. His thin white coat fluttered down onto his grey travel jacket. He seized both my hands and with tears in his eyes exclaimed, "But this is incredible. This is extraordinary, dear sir. I swear to you, it's been 30 years since I had such a delightful diversion. Allow me to express my heartfelt thanks, won't you? But you must become an actor or a musician. It's true that on such occasions I felt at the touch of the brilliant audacity of a great painter who would hastily sketch a ridiculous yet witty caricature onto the table in a circle of friends. After dinner, however, I returned alone to the salon and spent a solitary, melancholic hour playing chords on the instrument, trying to evoke the mood that the sight of Palermo had stirred within me. From Sicily I had briefly touched Africa, then went to Spain, where, near Madrid, it was in the countryside during the winter, on a dull, rainy afternoon, that I first felt the desire to return to Germany, and there was a need for it as well. Besides longing for a quiet, regulated, and settled life, it wasn't difficult to calculate that with all the restrictions. 20,000 marks would be spent by the time I arrived in Germany. Without much delay, I embarked on the slow journey back through France, which took roughly half a year during my extended stays in individual cities, and I vividly recall the summer evening when I arrived at the central German city's train station, which I had selected as my destination at the beginning of my trip, no slightly informed, with some experiences under my belt. With knowledge enriched and filled with a childlike joy, I find myself here in my carefree independence, and am content to establish an undisturbed and contemplative existence according to my modest means. It was then that I was 25 years old. The location was not poorly chosen. It is a respectable city, free from the cacophony of large metropolitan areas and the intrusive hustle and bustle of commerce, with several notable old squares on one side and a street life that neither lacks vibrancy nor parts of elegance. The surroundings hold many pleasant points, but I have always preferred the tastefully designed promenade that winds up the Lark's Hill, a narrow and elongated hill against which a large portion of the city leans, offering a vast view over houses, churches, and the gently meandering river into the distance. At certain points, especially during beautiful summer afternoons when a military band performs and carriages and pedestrians move about, one is reminded of the Pincio. But I will mention this promenade again. No one believes how much pleasure I took in preparing the spacious room I rented in the heart of the city, in a lively district, complete with an inconvenient bedroom. Though most of the parental furniture had been inherited by my sisters, I still had what I needed, substantial and refined pieces that arrived along with my books and 2 ancestral portraits. Most importantly, however, was the old grand piano that my mother had set aside for me. Indeed, when everything was arranged and ordered, as the photographs I had collected during my travels adorned all the walls, alongside the heavy mahogany desk and the bulging chest of drawers, and as I settled into a comfortable armchair by the window, ready and secure, to alternately observe the streets outside and my new apartment, my contentment was not minor. And yet I have not forgotten this moment. Alongside satisfaction and confidence, there stirred within me a subtle something else, a small feeling of fear and restlessness, a quiet awareness of some kind of rebellion and defiance on my part against an encroaching power. The somewhat oppressive thought that my situation, which had never been anything more than provisional up until this point, was now considered definitive and unalterable. I do not deny that these and similar feelings recurred from time to time. But are those certain afternoon hours entirely avoidable when one gazes into the growing dusk and perhaps a slow rain, becoming the victim of gloomy inclinations? In any case, it was clear that my future was completely secure. I had entrusted the round sum of 80,000 marks from the city bank, which earned, my God, times are hard, approximately 600 marks for the quarter, allowing me to live comfortably, stock up on reading materials, and occasionally visit a theatre, some lighter entertainment not excluded. My days passed in accordance with the ideal that had always been my goal. I would rise around 10 o'clock at breakfast and spend the time. Here is the translation of the text. Preserving the name Mann until midday, I would play the piano and read a literary journal or book. Then I would stroll up the street to my regular little restaurant for a meal, followed by a longer walk through the streets into a gallery around the neighborhood and up to the Lurkenberg. I returned home and resumed the activities of the morning reading, playing music, sometimes even engaging in some form of drawing or carefully crafting a letter. If I didn't attend a theatre or concert after dinner, I would spend time in a cafe reading newspapers until bedtime. However, the day had been good and beautiful, filled with moments of joy when a new and captivating motif emerged from my piano playing, or when a delicate feeling lingered after reading a novella or gazing at a painting. By the way, I must say that I approached my dispositions with a certain idealism and took great care to imbue each day with as much content as possible. My meals were modest, and I generally stuck to one outfit, living frugally to ensure I could afford a good seat at the opera or concert, purchase new literary works, and visit art exhibitions. But the days passed, transforming into weeks and months' boredom. I admit, not always having a book on hand to fill several hours can be challenging indeed. Without any luck, you tried to fantasize at the piano, sat by the window, smoked cigarettes, and an overwhelming sense of detachment from the world and yourself crept in. The familiar anxiety returned, and you jumped up, eager to escape, observing the hard-working people on the street with a wry smile, mentally and materially unequipped for leisure and enjoyment. X. Can a 27-year-old truly believe in the final, unchangeable nature of his circumstances, even if this inevitability seems highly probable? A bird's chirp, a tiny patch of blue sky, some half-forgotten dream at night, or these can suddenly flood his heart with vague hope, and Philip, with the festive anticipation of a great, unexpected fortune. I wandered from one day to the next, without a clear goal, caught up in this or that small hope, even if it was just the release of an entertaining magazine, convinced I was happy and sometimes a little wary from solitude. Truly, there were not many moments when a restlessness over lack of companionship and social interaction overcame me for what need is there to explain this. I had no connection with good society or the elite. Here is the translation of the text, preserving the name Mann in the second circle of the city, to introduce myself to the golden youth as a party goer. It lacked me the means, and on the other hand, the bohemian life. But I am a man of education. I wear clean clothes and a neat suit, and frankly, I don't feel like engaging in anarchistic conversations with unkempt young people around sticky absinthe tables. To cut a long story short, there was no specific social circle that I naturally belonged to, and the acquaintances that came about, one way or another, were rare, superficial and distant due to my own fault, as I admit, for I also held back with a sense of uncertainty and the uncomfortable awareness that I couldn't even briefly and clearly say to a painter who and what I truly was. By the way, I had indeed broken ties with society and abandoned it when I took the freedom to tread my own path without serving it in any way, and if I needed people to be happy, then I had to ask myself if I wasn't, in this case, too busy enriching myself for the greater good and earning general envy and respect. However, the fact remained that my philosophical solitude disheartened me to a much too high degree, and it ultimately did not align with my understanding of happiness, with my consciousness, my belief in being happy, whose shaking was, without a doubt, absolutely impossible. Not to be happy, to be unhappy, but was that even conceivable? It was unthinkable, and with this decision, the question was resolved until new hours arrived when this sitting for myself, this seclusion, and outsider status no longer seemed right, entirely out of order, and it made me moody in a shocking way. Moody? Was that a quality of the happy? I remembered my life at home, within the limited circle where I moved with the joyful awareness of my artistic talent, social, kind, eyes filled with cheerfulness, mockery, and condescending kindness for everyone, somewhat bewildering in the judgment of people, yet still popular. Back then, I had been happy even though I had to work at Mr. Schlievocht's large lumber business. And now. But a book of mass interest has appeared, a new French novel whose purchase I allowed myself, and which I will enjoy with leisure in my armchair. 300 pages again, full of taste, wit, and exquisite art. I have arranged my life to my liking. Am I perhaps not happy? Rickulosity. This question, and nothing more. X. Another day has come to an end, a day that cannot be denied. Thank God it had content. Evening has fallen, the window curtains are closed, the lamp burns on the desk. It's almost midnight. One could go to bed, but one remains. Lying half reclined in a plush armchair with folded hands in his lap, one gazes upwards at the ceiling, following with quiet submission the gentle throbbing and gnawing of an unspecified pain that cannot be banished. Just a few hours ago, I surrendered to the impact of a great work of art, one of those monstrous and cruel creations that shake us with the corrupted pomp of ruthless genius, bewilder us, numb us, torment us, enrapture us, crush us. My nerves still quiver, my imagination is stirred, rare moods have risen, and fallen within belongings, religious fervor, triumph, mystical peace, and there's a need that continually drives them, pushing them out, the need to express them, to share them, to show them, to make something of them. If only I were indeed an artist, able to manifest myself in clay words or works of art truthfully in all at once. But it is true that I am capable of many things. For example, I can take my place at the piano, giving full rein to my beautiful feelings in a quiet chamber. And this should be enough for me, for if to be happy, I needed people, I admit it. All of this alone, assuming that I also place some value on success and fame, recognitions, envy, love. By God, just thinking about the scene in Palermo, that I must admit a similar occurrence would be an incredibly comforting encouragement for me. Well considered, I cannot help but acknowledge this sophisticated and ludicrous distinction, the difference between inner and outer happiness. What is outer happiness anyway? There's a type of person, it seems, beloved children of God, whose happiness is genius and whose genius is happiness, sunlit beings who traverse life in a light, graceful, and lovable manner, surrounded by all the world, while everyone admires, praises, envies, and loves them, because even envy cannot hate them. They look at things like children with a mocking, spoiled, capricious, boisterous friendliness, secure in their happiness and genius, as if it could not be any other way. As for me, I do not deny the weakness that makes me want to belong to these people, and it continually seems to me, whether rightfully or wrongly, that I once belonged among them, completely the same, because let's be honest, it matters what one considers themselves, what they give themselves, on what they have assurance of giving. Perhaps in reality I have renounced this outer happiness by withdrawing from the service of society and arranging my life without people. But my satisfaction with this is as natural, no doubt can be cast upon it any moment to repeat. And so, with desperate urgency, to repeat, I want and must be happy. The conception of happiness as some sort of achievement, genius, refinement, or kindness, the perception of unhappiness as something loathsome, light-fearing, contemptible, and in a word, laughable, is too deep for me, truly, to even consider myself worthy if I were unhappy. How could I permit unhappiness? What role would I play before myself? Would I not be like a bat or owl sitting in the dark and enviously glancing at the light people, the kind and happy ones? I should hate them with that hatred which is nothing but poisoned love, and despise myself, sitting in the dark. And suddenly I remember what I've thought and felt from time to time about my outsider position and a philosophical solitude over these past months. And fear resurfaces, the familiar dread, and awareness of some kind of rebellion against a looming power. Undeniably, there was comfort found, distraction, numbing for this moment, and another, and yet another. But it returned, all of it, 1,000 times throughout the months and years. There are autumn days that are like a miracle. Summer has passed. The leaves have long begun to turn yellow outside, and in the city the wind has whistled around every corner for days, while murky streams gushed from the gutters. You've surrendered, you've virtually settled by the hearth to endure the winter. One morning upon awakening, with unbelieving eyes, you notice a thin strip of glowing blue peeking through the window curtains into your room. Quite astonished, you jump out of bed, open the window, and a wave of trembling sunlight washes over you as you simultaneously hear chatty and cheerful bird songs through all the street noise. while it feels like you're breathing in with the fresh and light air of an October first the incomparable sweet and promising flavor that usually belongs to May's winds. It's spring, it's clearly spring despite the calendar, and you throw yourself into your clothes to rush through the streets and out into the open under the shimmering sky. Such an unexpected and strange day appeared roughly 4 months ago now. We're currently at the beginning of February, and on that day I saw something exceptionally beautiful. Before 9 o'clock in the morning, I had set out, filled with a light and cheerful mood, an uncertain hope for change, surprises, and happiness, and I took the path to Lurchenburg. I climbed up the hill at the right end, and I followed its entire length, always staying on the main promenade along the edge and the low stone ramp, in order to enjoy the view over the city, which gently descends in terraces, and the river winding in the sun for the entire way, which takes perhaps about a half hour. And behind it, the landscape with hills and greenery faded into the sun mist. It was still nearly deserted up here. The benches beyond the path stood lonely, and here and there a statue poked out between the trees, shimmering white in the sun, while now and then a withered leaf slowly floated down upon it. The silence I listened to as I walked, keeping my gaze on a bright panorama to the side, remained undisturbed until I reached the end of the hill, where the path began to descend among ancient oaks. But behind me came the sound of horses' hooves and the rumble of a wagon drawing near at a brisk pace, and I had to make way for it in the middle of the descent. I stepped aside and stopped. It was a small, light, two-wheeled hunting carriage with 2 large, gleaming, snorting foxes pulling it. The reins were held by a young lady, perhaps 19 or 20 years old, alongside an elderly gentleman of imposing and noble bearing, with a white, rust-brushed mustache and thick white eyebrows. A servant in simple black silver livery sat on the back seat. The horse's pace had slowed at the start of the descent, as one of them seemed nervous, rested. It had moved far sideways from the trace, pressing its head against its chest and setting its slender legs with such trembling resistance that the elderly gentleman, a little concerned, bent forward to help the young lady tighten the reins with his elegant, gloved left hand. The steering seemed to have been entrusted to her only temporarily and half in jest. At any rate, it appeared as if she treated driving with a kind of childlike gravity and inexperience. She made a small, serious and indignant gesture of her head as she tried to calm the skittish animal. She was brunette and slender. Her hair, which had been wound tightly into a knot over her nape and lay softly and loosely around her forehead and temples, allowing individual light brown strands to be seen, wore a round, dark straw hat decorated with a small arrangement of ribbon work. By the way, she was wearing a short, dark blue jacket and a plain grey skirt. Her oval, delicate face, whose soft, brown complexion had been freshly flushed by the morning air, had certainly the most attractive features in its pair of slender and elongated eyes, whose barely visible iris was dazzlingly black, and above them were an exceptionally uniform and feathered brow. And the nose might have been a little too long, and her mouth, whose lips were at any rate clear and fine, could have been narrower. However, at that moment the shimmering white and slightly staggered teeth gave her face a charm with which she energetically pressed the horse's lower lip as she struggled to control it, and raised her almost childlike round chin a little. it would be entirely wrong to say that this face was of striking or admirable beauty. It had the allure of youth and the joyful freshness, and this allure was smoothed over, calmed, and refined by a prosperous carelessness, genteel upbringing, and luxurious care. It was certain that those slim and glistening eyes, now gazing with spoiled anger at the headstrong horse, would in the next minute resume their expression of secure and effortless happiness. The sleeves of the jacket, which were wide and full on the shoulders, hugged the slender wrists just barely, and I have never received a more enchanting impression of exquisite elegance than through the manner in which these slim, bare, dull, white hands held the reins. I stood by the roadside, and untouched by any glance as the carriage passed by, and I walked slowly on as it set off again into its trot and swiftly disappeared. What I felt was joy and admiration, but at the same time a strange and piercing pain awoke within me, a bitter and pressing feeling of jealousy. Love I dared not even think itself loathing. As I write, the image of a beggar wretchedly staring at the precious shimmer of a gem in a jeweller's window comes to mind. This man will never have within him the clear desire for grace, for even the thought of such a desire would be a ridiculous impossibility that would make a laughingstock of him before his own eyes. Sigh. I want to tell you that by chance I saw this young lady again after 8 days, and indeed for the second time, at the opera. Gounod's Margaret was being performed, and as soon as I entered the brightly lit hall to make my way to my seat in the balcony, I noticed her on the left of the old gentleman, in a proscenium box on the other side. Besides, I realized that for some reason I felt a silly shiver and some confusion, and without any particular reason my eyes wandered immediately over to the other rows and boxes. Only at the beginning of the overture did I decide to take a closer look at the gentleman. The old gentleman, seated with quiet dignity in his chair, reclined in a tightly buttoned frock coat, with a black ribbon resting one of his brown, clad hands lightly on the velvet of the box's railing, while occasionally stroking his beard, or the short grey hair on his forehead. In contrast, the young girlish daughter, no doubt, sat interestedly and eagerly bent forward, both her hands holding her fan on the velvet cushion. From time to time she would make a brief head movement to push back her loose light brown hair from her brow and temples. She wore a very light silk blouse with a violet bouquet in its belt, and her slim eyes sparkled even blacker in the bright lighting than they had 8 days prior. By the way, I observed, I know the expression on her face at that time was quite peculiar to her. At every moment she would set her white teeth, gleaming at regular intervals, on her lower lip and slightly raise her chin. This innocent look, with its mouth set in this peculiar fashion. Here is the translation of the text, preserving the name Manon no coquette betrayed the quiet and cheerful gaze of her eyes. Her delicate and white neck free, and wrapped in a narrow silk band, the colour of her waist, the way she occasionally turned to the old gentleman, drawing his attention to something in the orchestra, the curtain, or a box. All this evoked an impression of unmeasurable refinement and enchanting childishness, yet without any hint of sentimentality. It was a refined, measured, and elegant kind of childhood, secured by a life of grace, and she exuded a happiness that was not boastful, but rather quiet, because it was taken for granted. Gounod's intellectual and tender music seemed to me the perfect accompaniment to this scene, and I listened to it unaware of the stage, fully immersed in a gentle and contemplative mood, that might have been more melancholy without the music. Already during the intermission following the first act, a gentleman aged between 27 and 30 rose from his parquet seat. He disappeared for a moment before reappearing in my line of sight, with a graceful bow in the box I was observing. The old gentleman extended his hand, and the young lady offered hers with a friendly nod, which he delicately touched to his lips. He was then invited to sit down. I confess I am prepared to admit that this gentleman possessed the most remarkable shirt cuffs I have ever seen in my life. They were completely exposed, as his vest was nothing but a narrow black strip, and his tailcoat, not closing earlier than well below the waist by a button, was cut unusually wide from the shoulders. But the shirt cuffs secured at the high and sharply standing collar by a broad black ribbon, and adorned with 2 large square black buttons at regular intervals, were of dazzling white and amazingly reinforced without lacking flexibility. They formed an attractive dip around his stomach before rising into a pleasing and shimmering lump. Of course, this shirt demanded most of the attention, but his head, perfectly round and covered by a skull cap of close-clipped, bright blonde hair, was embellished with a frameless monocle, a not too thick blonde, slightly curled mustache, and on one cheek numerous small scars that ran up to his temple. By the way, this gentleman was flawlessly built and moved with confidence. Throughout the evening in the box, as he remained the boxer, I observed 2 positions he adopted that seemed particularly peculiar to him. Indeed, when the conversation with the other gentleman ceased, he sat with one leg over the other, resting comfortably back on his knees, head lowered, and the telescope on his lap, pushing it down. He intensely focused his gaze, diving into the contemplation of the ends of his 2 mustaches, completely hypnotized by it, and slowly and silently turning his head from one side to the other. In a conversation with the young lady otherwise, he adjusted his position out of respect, leaning back even further while gripping both sides of his chair, lifting his head as high as possible, and grinning down at his young neighbor in a charming and somewhat superior manner with his mouth wide open. This gentleman must have been filled with a wonderful sense of well-being. In all seriousness, I know how to appreciate such things. Not one of his movements, even if his nonchalance was daring, caused any embarrassment. He was carried by his self-assurance. And why shouldn't it be? It was clear he had taken the correct path without standing out too much, continuing on this path towards clear and useful goals, living in the shadow of agreement with everyone and basking in the sun of general respect. Meanwhile, he sat in the loge chatting with a young girl whose pure and exquisite allure he perhaps wasn't entirely indifferent to, and he could confidently ask for her hand in this case. Honestly, I don't feel like saying anything derogatory about this gentleman, but as for me, I sat down below, watching from afar, gloomily observing that precious and unattainable creature chatting and laughing with this insignificant person, excluded, unnoticed, unjustified, foreign, offline, degraded, a pariah wretched in my own eyes. I stayed until the end and met the 3 gentlemen in the wardrobe, where they took a moment to put on their pelts and exchanged a few words, here with a lady, there with an officer. The young gentlemen accompanied father and daughter as they left the theatre, and I followed them at a small distance through the lobby. It wasn't raining. A few stars were out, and no carriage was taken. Slowly and chatting, the 3 walked ahead of me, which I watched from a cautious distance, crushed and tormented by a stabbing, mocking, wretched feeling. Not far to go, barely had we taken one street when we stopped in front of a stately house with a simple facade, and soon after father and daughter bid their companion goodbye and disappeared, while he sped away. The heavy, carved door of the house bore the name Councillor Rayner. Doxaye. I am determined to finish this transcript, even though at every moment I feel like jumping up and running away from internal resistance. I have dug and probed so deeply into this matter until exhaustion. I am sickened by it all. It's been no more than 3 months since the newspapers informed me of a bazaar organized for charitable purposes in the City Hall with the participation of the noble world. I read this announcement deserved my attention, and I was immediately determined to visit the bazaar. I thought she would be there, perhaps as a seller, and in that case nothing would prevent me from approaching her. Calmly considering, I am a man of education and good family, and if this Miss Rayner takes my fancy, then on such an occasion it is no more denied to me than to the gentleman with the remarkable shirt. Cuff display to address her. Exchange a few playful words. It was a windy and rainy afternoon when I made my way to the town hall, where a crowd of people and wagons were gathered at the entrance. I carved out a path through the building, paid the entrance fee, left my overcoat and hat in storage, and with some effort ascended the broad, crowded staircase to the first floor and into the assembly hall. From there, a sultry mist of wine, food, perfumes, and pine needle scent, a chaotic noise of laughter, conversation, music, exclamations, and gong strikes drifted towards me. The immense and spacious room was brightly decorated with flags and garlands, and along the walls, like in the centre, stalls stretched out, both open sales points and closed compartments, from which fantastically masked gentlemen recommended their wares with full lungs. The ladies selling flowers, handicrafts, tobacco, and refreshments of all kinds were similarly costumed in various ways. At the far end of the hall, a music band played on a platform filled with plants, while in the narrow passage between the stalls, a compact stream of people slowly moved forward. Little struck by the sound of the music, the fortune tellers, and the amusing advertisements, I joined the current, and before a minute had passed, I spotted the young lady I was seeking 4 steps to the left of the entrance. She was selling wines and sodas in a small stall adorned with pine needles, dressed as an Italian, with the colourful skirt, the white square headpiece, and the short bodice of Albanian women, revealing her delicate arms from the elbow down. A little flushed, she leaned against the sales table, played with her colourful fan, and chatted with several gentlemen who stood around the stall smoking, among whom I recognized the familiar face at first glance. He was standing at the table, his hands in the side pockets of his jacket. I slowly made my way forward, determined to approach as soon as an opportunity arose when she would be less busy. Ah! It remained to be seen if I still had any residual sense of happy security and self-assured agility, or if the gloominess and half despair of my past weeks were justified. What had really disturbed me? From where, in front of this girl, did this distressing and wretched mix of envy, love, shame, and irritated bitterness come over me again, heating up my face as I confess? Courage! Kindness! Cheerful and graceful self-assurance, by God, befitting a skilled and happy person. And I thought with a nervous eagerness for the playful turn, the good word, the Italian address, with which I would Here is the translation of the text while preserving the name man I intended to approach them, but it took a good while for me to find my way around the crowded room and reach the wine stop. By the time I got there, the circle of gentlemen had disappeared, and the only familiar face was still leaning against the bar, engaging in a lively conversation with the young salesgirl. Well, I thought to myself, I must interrupt this. And with a swift turn, I left the crowd and stood at the table. What happened? Nothing. Nearly nothing. The conversation ceased. The familiar man took a step aside, adjusting his round, frame-less glasses with all 5 fingers, and looked at me through them, while the young lady glanced at me calmly, appraisingly from my suit down to my boots. That suit wasn't new, and those boots were caked in street dirt. I knew that. Moreover, I was flushed, and my hair might very well have been a mess. I was not cool-free, or at ease with the situation. The feeling of being an intruder, a stranger, an unwelcome guest, making a fool of myself, washed over me. Uncertainty, helplessness, hatred, and pity clouded my vision, and in one word I carried out my cheerful intentions by furrowing my brows, speaking in a hoarse voice with short, almost rude gestures. I'd like a glass of wine. It doesn't matter if I was mistaken when I thought I saw the young girl cast a quick, scornful glance at her friend. Silent as he and I, she handed me the wine, and without lifting her gaze, blushing and embarrassed, a pitiful and ridiculous figure, I stood between them, drank a few sips, placed the money on the table, bowed my head in disbelief, left the room, and stumbled outside. From that moment it was over for me, and it's even more bitter that a few days later I read in the newspapers, I have the honor to announce the engagement of my daughter Anna to Mr. Assessor Dr. Alfred Whitnagel. Civ. From that moment it was over for me. My last remnant of happiness and self-assurance shattered beyond repair. I can't go on. No, I admit I am unhappy, and I see a pitiful and ridiculous figure in myself. But I cannot bear this. I am destined to perish. I will kill myself today or tomorrow. My first reaction, my instinct, was the clever attempt to extract some literary beauty from this situation and rephrase my wretched condition as unfortunate love. A folly that goes without saying. No one perishes because of an unfortunate love. Unfortunate love is a pose, not bad in itself. In an unfortunate love one pleases each other, but it's my own ruin that with every self-love hope disappears. I am perishing from the fact that everything about me has come to an end without hope. Love if, once this question is finally permitted, I love that girl for real. Perhaps. But how and why? Wasn't this love a product of my long-provoked and sickly vanity, which ached at first sight of this unattainable gem, birthing feelings of envy, hatred, and self-loathing, for which love was merely a pretext, an escape, and a saviour? Yes, it was all vanity. And didn't my father once call me a jester? Oh, I had no right to set myself apart and ignore society, especially as I'm too vain to endure their scorn or miss their approval. But is it about having the right, or is it about necessity? And would my useless jester persona have been suitable for any social standing? Well, this jester's persona is what ultimately led me astray. Indifference, I know that would be a kind of happiness. But I'm unable to be indifferent toward myself. I can't see myself through the eyes of people. And my guilty conscience consumes me filled with innocence. Shouldn't a guilty conscience ever be anything but vain? There's only one misfortune, losing pleasure in oneself. Not being able to please oneself is the misfortune. I've always felt very clearly. Everything else is play and enrichment of life. In every other suffering, you can be so extraordinarily content with yourself, so exceptionally exceptional. It's only inner discord, a guilty conscience when suffering, the battles of vanity that make one look pitiful and repulsive. An old acquaintance appeared on the scene, a gentleman named Schilling, with whom I once served in Mr. Schliervogt's large woodworking business. He touched base as in townsness and came to visit me, a skeptical individual, hands in his pockets, with a black rimmed pincers and a realistic, patient shrug of the shoulders. He arrived in the evening and said, "I'll stay here for a few days." We went to a wine tavern. He greeted me as if I were still the lucky, self-satisfied man he once knew, believing he was only offering his own joyful opinion, and said, "For God's sake, you've made your life pleasant, my boy. Independent, what? Free? You're right, actually, to hell with it. We only live once, right? What else does it matter in the end? You're the smarter one between us, I have to say. By the way, you were always a genius," and as before he continued to willingly acknowledge and please me, unaware that on my part I was terrified of disappointing him. With desperate efforts I tried to maintain the position I had in his eyes, remaining at the peak, appearing happy and self-satisfied. "For free!" I lacked every spine, every good courage, every composure. I approached him with a dull feeling of embarrassment and indecision, and he grasped it all with incredible speed. It was horrifying to see how, having been fully prepared to recognize me as a happy and superior person, he began to pierce through my facade, looking at me in surprise, growing cold, becoming aloof, and finally showing his disdain with every expression. He left early the next day, and a few fleeting lines informed me that he was still compelled to leave. It is a fact everyone is so wrapped up in their own affairs that they cannot seriously form an opinion about another person. They accept with lazy willingness the level of respect you dare display before yourself. Live as you wish, act as you please, but show bold confidence and no guilt, and no one will be moral enough to despise you. And on the other hand, experiencing your self-assurance, giving up self-satisfaction, and showing that you despise yourself, and people will unanimously agree with you. As for me, I am lost. I stop writing, I throw down the pen filled with revulsion. To conclude it, but wouldn't it almost be heroic for a bajazzo? It seems that I will, alas, continue to live, eat, sleep, and become vaguely accustomed to being an unlucky and ridiculous figure. My God, who would have thought, who could have imagined that it is such a fate, a misfortune to be born a bajazzo? Tobias Mindernickel, I, one of the streets that leads steeply from the Quagas into the city center is called the Grey Path. About halfway down this street, on the right if you're coming from the river, stands number 47, a narrow, dull-color building that blends in with its neighbors in no way. On the ground floor is a corner shop where one can also find rubber shoes and castor oil. If you walk through, looking out over an inner courtyard where cats roam up the hallway, you'll find a narrow, worn wooden staircase that smells unbearably musty and poor. On the first floor, to the left, lives a carpenter, to the right a midwife. On the second floor, to the left, lives a boot repairman. To the right, a lady who begins singing loudly as soon as footsteps are heard on the stairs. On the third floor, to the left, the apartment is empty, and to the right lives someone named Mindernickel, whose name also Tobias. There's a story about him that deserves to be told because it's mysterious and shameful beyond belief. The outward appearance of Minder Nickel is striking, strange, and ridiculous. For example, when he goes for a walk, his thin, stooped figure moving up the street, dressed entirely in black from head to toe, wearing an old-fashioned style. Here is the translation of the text preserving the name man, a man with a frayed and rough cylinder, an old-fashioned tight coat, and similarly shabby lower garments that are frayed at the bottom and so short as to reveal the rubber insert of his ankle boots. It should be mentioned that his clothes are meticulously brushed. His gaunt neck appears even longer as it rises from a low folding collar. The silvered hair is smooth and combed deep into his temples, and the broad rim of the cylinder shades a shaven and pale face with hollow cheeks, inflamed eyes that rarely lift from the ground, and two deep grooves that unpleasantly run from his nose to the corners of his mouth drawn downward. Man seldom leaves his home, and there's a reason for this. As soon as he appears on the street, many children gather around, following him for some distance, laughing, cheering, singing, "Ho, ho, Tobias," and perhaps even tugging at his skirt, while people step forward to their doors and enjoy the spectacle. He himself walks away without resisting or looking round nervously, with his shoulders hunched and his head raised as if in a rush through a downpour without an umbrella. And though people laugh into his face, he greets here and there someone among those waiting at the doors with a humble courtesy. Later, when children fall behind, when no one recognizes him and only a few glance his way, his behavior does not change significantly. He continues to look around nervously and slink away as if feeling 1,000 mocking glances on his back, and when he raises his uncertain, timid eyes from the ground, one notices the peculiarity that he is unable to firmly and calmly fix his gaze on any person or even object. It seems, that it may sound strange that he lacks the natural sensory perceptive superiority with which an individual looks at the world of appearances. He appears to feel inferior to every appearance, and his feeble eyes must crawl to the ground in front of both people and things. What is the story of this man who is always alone and seems to be unnaturally unhappy? His forced bourgeois clothing and a certain careful movement of his hand over his chin suggest that he does not want to be counted among the social class in whose midst he lives. God knows what has been played out with him. His face looks as if life has laughed mockingly at him with a full fist. By the way, it is very possible that, without experiencing heavy misfortunes, he simply could not cope with existence itself, and his suffering, inferiority, and foolishness make an embarrassing impression, as if nature had denied him the balance, strength, and backbone necessary to exist with his head held high. Here is the translation of the text while preserving the name man. Without any jewelry, only the chest, a solid empire-style furniture piece with heavy metal handles, held value and beauty. Outside the window, whose view was hopelessly blocked by the grey side wall of the neighbouring house, stood a flower pot filled with dirt in which nothing grew. Nonetheless, Tobias Mann sometimes went there, looked at the flower pot and sniffed the bare earth. Next to this room was a small, dark bedroom. After entering, Tobias put down his cylinder and cane on the table, sat on the green, upholstered sofa that smelled of dust, rested his chin in his hand, and stared ahead with raised eyebrows at the ground. It seemed like there was nothing left for him to do on earth. As for man's character, it is very difficult to judge The following incident speaks well for him. One day, when the peculiar man left the house, and as usual a crowd of children followed him, mocking and laughing, a 10-year-old boy stumbled over another's foot and hit the pavement so hard that his nose and forehead bled, causing him to cry and lie down. Promptly, Tobias turned around, rushed to the fallen boy, bent over him, and began speaking with a soft, quivering voice, comforting him. "Poor child," he said, "have you yourself? You're bleeding. Look, blood is running down from your forehead. Yes, 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 how pitiful you lie there now. Of course, it hurts so much that it makes you cry. Poor child, how much compassion I have for you. It was your fault, but I will wrap my handkerchief around your head. Now be careful. Now get up." And after saying these words, he actually wrapped his own handkerchief around the boy's head. He carefully helped him stand on his feet and left. His posture and face at that moment showed a distinctly different expression from usual. He walked firmly and upright, and his chest rose deeply beneath his tight coat. His eyes had widened, acquiring a gleam as they focused with certainty on people and things around him, while a hint of painful happiness lingered around his mouth. This incident led to a temporary decrease in the taunting spirit of the people from Groenweg Greypath. However, after some time passed, his surprising behavior was forgotten, and many healthy, cheerful, and cruel voices once again echoed behind him. Who, Tobias, a yellow and muscular 4-month-old animal with a black ring around its eyes and a black ear. When Tobias noticed this from a distance of 10 steps, he stopped, stroked his chin several times, and looked contemplatively at the cellar and the alert puppy wagging its tail. Then he began walking again, circling the crutch he leaned on 3 times around the tree it was propped against, took a step closer to the tree, and said, while keeping a steady gaze on the animal, in a quiet and rushed voice, "How much is this dog?" 10 marks, replied the seller. Tobias paused for a moment, then hesitantly repeated, 10 marks. "Yes," confirmed the seller. Tobias took out a black leather purse from his pocket, removed a 5-mark bill, a 3-mark coin, and a 2-mark piece, quickly handed over this money to the seller, grabbed the leash, and hurried away with the squirming and whining animal behind him. The dog resisted throughout their journey, kicking its front legs against the ground and looking up at its new master warily. But Tobias pulled steadily and energetically, successfully navigating through the city streets. Below the street youth of Greyway, a tremendous commotion erupted as Tobias and the dog appeared. He took the animal onto his arm, bent over it, and rushed up the stairs to his room, ignoring jeers and laughter from onlookers. Once inside, he placed the dog on the floor, stroked it affectionately, and said condescendingly, "Now then, you don't need to be afraid of me, you creature. That's not necessary." He took a plate of cooked meat and potatoes from a dresser drawer and tossed some to the dog, which stopped whining and gobbled up its meal. "By the way," Tobias said, "are you going to be called Esau?" "Got it. Esau. You can keep that simple sound." He pointed to the floor and commanded, "Esau." The dog, perhaps expecting more food, came running. Tobias patted him on the side approvingly while saying, "That's right, my friend, I have every right to praise you." Then he took a step back, pointed at the ground, and ordered again, "Esau." The animal, now fully alert, leapt towards him and licked his master's boot. Tobias repeated this exercise with unflagging joy, issuing commands and seeing them carried out 12 to 14 times. Finally, however, the dog seemed exhausted as if he wanted to rest and digest his meal. He assumed the elegant and intelligent pose of a hunting hound, lying down with both long, slender front legs stretched out beside him. "One more time," Tobias said. "Esau." But Esau turned his head to the side and remained still. "Esau," Tobias called out in a commanding voice, raising it. "Come here." But Esau remained unmoved. "Even if you're tired." But Esau laid his head on his paws and didn't move an inch. Then a mass of indignation, out of all proportion and mad, seized the small nickel. He grabbed his black cane, lifted Esau by the nape of his neck, and hit at the crying little creature with it as he raged, his voice shrieking with fury, "How dare you not obey? Do you think it's a good idea to challenge me?" Finally he put down the stick, placed the whimpering dog on the ground, and began pacing back and forth, his hands on his hips, taking long strides while casting furious glances at Esau. After continuing this for some time, he stopped by the animal, which was lying on its back with its front legs twitching in supplication, crossed his arms over his chest, and spoke with a cold and hard look and voice like Napoleon addressing his company after losing their eagle in battle. "Tell me, how have you behaved?" The dog, already thrilled by this closeness, crawled closer to him, nestled against his leg, and looked up at him with pleading eyes. For a while Tobias silently regarded the humble creature from above. Then, as he felt the warm body against his leg, he lifted Esau onto the sofa. "Well, I'll show you mercy," he said. But as soon as the good animal began licking his face, his mood turned completely to compassion and sadness. He held the dog close, his eyes filling with tears, and repeated it several times in a choked voice, "See, you're my only, my only." Then he carefully laid Esau on the sofa, sat down next to him, rested his chin in his hand, and looked at him with kind and quiet eyes. Now Tobias Minder Nickel left the house even less often than before, as he didn't want to be seen publicly with Esau. But all his attention was given to the dog. Indeed, from morning till night he devoted himself entirely to feeding, wiping, commanding, scolding, and talking to him like a human being. However, there was one thing: Esau wasn't always pleased. When he lay next to Tobias on the sofa, looking at him with melancholic eyes because of lack of air and freedom, Tobias would be perfectly content. He sat silently in a self-satisfied posture, stroking Esau's back while saying, "Do you look at me sorrowfully, my poor friend? Yes, yes, the world is sad, you will also learn, as young as you are." Yet, when the animal, blind and reckless with play and hunting drive, drove around the room, wrestling with a slipper, jumping on to chairs, and rolling over in immense energy, Tobias followed its movements from a distance with a helpless, resentful, and uncertain gaze, accompanied by a smile that was ugly and irritating, until he finally called it to him in an unyielding tone and commanded, "Now stop your arrogance. There's no reason to jump around." On one occasion, Esau even escaped from the room and sprinted down the stairs into the street, where he soon began chasing a cat, eating horse manure, and playing happily with the children. However, on the day Tobias appeared under the applause and laughter of half the street, with a painfully contorted face, the sad event occurred when the dog ran away in long strides from his master. On that day, Tobias beat the dog for a long time with bitter intensity. One day the dog had already belonged to him for several weeks. Tobias, to feed Esau, took a loaf of bread out of the chest of drawers and began using the large knife with a bone handle, which he often used in a bent over position to cut small pieces that fell to the ground. But the animal, senseless from hunger and foolishness, jumped blindly towards it, ran into the awkwardly held knife under its right shoulder blade, and writhed on the ground in pain. Startled Tobias put everything aside and bent over the wounded dog. Suddenly, however, his facial expression changed, and it is true that a glimmer of relief and happiness passed over him. He carefully carried the whimpering dog onto the sofa, and no one can imagine with what devotion he began to nurse the sick animal. He did not leave its side during the day, allowed it to sleep on its own bed at night, washed and bandaged it, stroked, comforted, and pitied it with tireless joy and care. "Does it hurt a lot?" he asked. "Yes, yes, you are suffering bitterly, my poor animal. But be quiet, we have to bear it." His face was calm, sarcastic, and happy as he spoke, as Esau regained strength, became happier, and recovered, and Tobias' behavior grew restless and dissatisfied. He no longer wanted to tend to the wound, but only showed his compassion to the dog through words and caresses. The healing process had made significant progress. Esau had a good nature. He began moving around the room again, and one day, after emptying a plate of milk and white bread, he jumped down from the sofa fully healed, bounding joyfully, and with his old unrestrained energy through both rooms, pulling at the bed covers, chasing a potato in front of him, and rolling over in pleasure. Tobias stood by the window, beside a flower pot, as one of his long and skinny hands, which emerged from the frayed sleeve, mechanically twirled the deep furrowed hair on his temples. His figure, here is the translation, while preserving the name, man, he stood out, dark and peculiar from the grey wall of the neighbour's house. His face was pale and contorted with grief, and with a glazed, embarrassed, envious and malicious gaze, he immobily watched Esau's leaps. Suddenly, however, he roused himself, walked towards him, grabbed him, and slowly cradled him in his arms. My poor creature. He began with a whimpering voice, but Esau, unrestrained and not inclined to endure such treatment any further, snapped at the hand, trying to pet him, escaped from his grasp, leaped to the ground, made a playful side-step, barked, and ran off happily. What happened next was so incomprehensible and despicable that I refuse to describe it in detail. Tobias Mindernickel stood with his arms hanging limply at his sides, slightly bent forward, his lips squeezed together, and his eyes trembled unnervingly in their sockets. And then, suddenly, with a kind of mad leap, he caught the animal. A large gleaming object flashed in his hand, and with a cut that ran from his right shoulder deep into his chest, the dog crumpled to the ground and made no sound. He simply fell on his side, bleeding and shivering. In the next instant, he lay on the sofa, and Tobias knelt before him, pressing a cloth over the wound and stammering, My poor creature, how sad everything is! How sad we both are! Do you suffer?" Yes, I know you do. How pitifully you lie there before me. But I am with you. I comfort you. I will use my best handkerchief." Only Esau lay there and gasped. His clouded and questioning eyes were filled with incomprehension, innocence, and lament for his master, and then he stretched out his legs a little and died. Tobias, however, remained immobile in his position. He had laid his face on Esau's body and wept bitterly. Here is the translated text with the name preserved as Man to the Woman. Noem 3. Elsbeth Meyer, The Drama of a Child. Goem 1. Peter Nansen, A Happy Marriage. Sind Ed. Goem 2. Peter Nansen Marriage. Some edition Goem 2. Peter Nansen, Julie's Diary. Novel. Goem 3.50. Peter Nansen, God's Peace. Novel. Goem 3. Gabriel Ritter, From a Good Family. A Story of Suffering for a Young Girl. Novel. Go M4, Gabriel Reuter, The Artist of Life, novella. Go M3. Ernst Rosmer, Madonna, novellas. Go M2, also published. M3, Arthur Schnitzler, Dying, novella. Go M2, also published as M3A, Sadel C. Berlin, C. New Friedrichstadt 48. The following lists all the changed text lines with the original line first and the modified line after. Thomas, Go M. Thomas, 2. No change. Also the unfulfilled desires, longing. He loved her for her wishes too, yearnings. He loved her for her unfulfilled wishes, longing. Original line split into 2 with slight rephrasing. He loved her for her unanswerable, but she merely looked ahead in an exalted state court until he was outside in the chestnut alley, smoking slowly a cigarette while she inhaled the smoke through her nose. Reordered and edited for clarity, yeah? When they leave, she asked. When did you leave? Direct translation of the original line. Everydayness and boredom stir my last days. I fear everydayness and boredom stirring my last days. Paraphrase for flow, she reached out her hand to me, a soft, seemingly boneless hand. Reordered for better grammar, Thursday, he mustn't forget her 5 o'clock tea. She pleaded. Direct translation with slight rephrasing. In the city not yet long, I'd been a few months in the country. Original line split into 2, and you. Direct translation apathy, with which he turned to me, I today to you as a friend, and also today to you as a friend. Paraphrased for better flow, do you actually know? I asked what sort of connection there is with. Original line, split and rephrased after everything in the end, and as a worthy outcome, indeed. Everything most remarkable music drama to be performed upon. My most remarkable music dramas to be performed upon. Paraphrased for clarity, I yearn after a quiet, regulated and settled life, on the other hand, and also after a street life that is neither vivacious nor bright. Original line reordered and edited for better flow, in their oval and delicately formed face, whose delicate brunette hair. Line continued from previous segment. Here is the translation while preserving the name Mann in his oval and finely shaped face, whose delicate brunette complexion became more apparent in earnest conversations. I know how to appreciate such things. No one ever glanced at me with a quiet, scrutinizing look just once over my suit, as if to ask, what does it matter to you? You are the only one who did that. What does it matter to me in the end? It's about this man who is always alone. What kind of story is there behind him? As Tobias' behavior became more restless and dissatisfied, he hermed, Bar, ja, M2, herm, Balacalis. Go. M2. Gerhard Hauptmann, The Apostle, Novella Studies. Gerhard Hauptmann, The Apostle, Novella Studies, 3rd, 4th edition. Go M150, Jeb M. 3rd, 4th edition. Go. 150.
Felix 50. Ja, Storm in the 1
4. Felix Hollander, Storm in the West. Go. M. Ford, Hans Land, Mother's Right, a novella. Go. 1. Hans Land, Mother's Right, a novella. Go M. 1. Gabriel Renter, From a Good Family. Suffering Gabriel Reuter, From a Good Family. Suffering Story of Gabriel Reuter, The Artist of Life, novella. Go. M3. Gabriel Reuter, The Artist of Life, novella. Go. M3. 1. Gabriel Renter, From a Good Family. Suffering Gabriel Reuter, From a Good Family. Suffering Story of Gabriel Reuter, The Artist of Life, novella. Go. M3. Gabriel Reuter, The Artist of Life, novella. Go. M3.